Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take some time off from the chaos of my city life. My name is Eric, and I'd spent most of my adult years working as a mechanical engineer. I was one of those people who never really took vacations, always caught up in deadlines and projects. That summer, though, something in me snapped. I needed a break, and the thought of being near the ocean, away from everything, seemed like a perfect escape. My childhood friend, Peter, had been running a small boat repair business along the rugged coastline of Maine for the last few years. Peter wasn't just a friend, he was practically a brother to me. We'd grown up together, gone to school together, and even gotten into trouble together more times than I could count. He invited me to come stay with him for a couple of weeks at his place, a quaint little house right on the edge of the coast. When I arrived, the salty sea air hit me like a wave of nostalgia. Peter's house was perched on a cliff with a panoramic view of the Atlantic. The setting was perfect. The endless blue of the water, the calls of seagulls overhead, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. Life felt simple here, and I could already feel the stress peeling away from me like layers of old paint. The first few days were idyllic. Peter showed me around the local town, which was as charming as it was small. The locals greeted us with friendly nods, and the tiny diners served the best clam chowder I'd ever tasted. Peter's house had a small but comfortable guest room where I stayed. Every night, I'd fall asleep to the rhythmic sound of the ocean, a far cry from the blaring car horns and city noise I'd grown used to. One evening, while we were sitting on his back porch watching the sunset, Peter mentioned the old lighthouse down the coast. It stood on a rocky outcrop about 2 miles from his house. They decommissioned it years ago, he said, sipping his coffee. But it's still there, standing against the elements. People around here say it's haunted. I laughed it off. Haunted? Come on, Peter. You're not serious. Peter shrugged. I'm not saying I believe it, but I'm not saying I don't either. Weird stuff happens there. Lights flicker at night, even though there's no power. Some say they've seen figures moving in the windows. Figures? I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, like shadows. Could just be tricks of the light or something. But people around here avoid it. They say anyone who goes too close comes back. Different. I rolled my eyes at his dramatic tone, but a small part of me couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his words left behind. The next day, Peter had to head into town early to work on a client's boat. With the house to myself, I decided to take a walk along the coast. The air was crisp, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky shoreline. As I walked, I noticed the lighthouse in the distance. It stood tall and weathered, its white paint chipped and peeling. Something about it was both majestic and eerie, like it didn't quite belong in the present day. Despite Peter's warnings, or maybe because of them, I found myself drawn to it. There was something about the way it loomed over the cliffs, standing defiant against time and the sea. As I got closer, I noticed how silent the area became. The sound of the waves seemed to fade, replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. I stopped at the base of the path that led up to the lighthouse. The gate was rusted shut, and a weathered sign hung from it. Keep out. I debated for a moment whether to climb over, but the uneasy feeling from Peter's story came rushing back. Instead, I turned around and made my way back to the house. When Peter returned later that afternoon, I casually mentioned my walk and how I'd gotten close to the lighthouse. His face darkened. You didn't go in, did you? He asked. No, I replied, taken aback by the sudden seriousness in his voice. Good, he said, his tone firm. Stay away from that place, Eric. I'm not joking. There's something off about it. I nodded, not wanting to press the issue, but Peter's reaction only fueled my curiosity. What was it about this lighthouse that unsettled him, and apparently the entire town? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the sound of the ocean filled the room. I couldn't shake the image of the lighthouse from my mind. It felt like it was calling to me, daring me to come closer. Over the next few days, life returned to normal. Peter and I spent our time fixing up his workshop, fishing, and just enjoying the peace and quiet of the coast. But the lighthouse lingered in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I started noticing it more, even when I wasn't near it, like a presence I couldn't ignore. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, I saw a faint flicker of light in the distance, coming from the direction of the lighthouse. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it happened again, a soft, steady glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. I sat up, staring out the window. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably just some pranksters, maybe kids messing around. But another part of me wasn't so sure. Whatever it was, it didn't feel normal. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the faint light I'd seen coming from the lighthouse. It wasn't a beam sweeping across the night sky like it had been in its functional days. It was more of a soft, erratic glow, almost as if someone were carrying a lantern through the structure. It didn't make sense. Peter had said there was no power running to the lighthouse anymore, and the idea of someone wandering around an abandoned structure in the dead of night seemed absurd. When I brought it up over breakfast, Peter didn't seem surprised, but he wasn't exactly thrilled either. He paused mid-bite, his fork hovering over his plate. "You saw it, huh?" I nodded. "Yeah, a light. It wasn't very bright, but it was definitely there." "What's the deal with that place, Peter? You keep warning me to stay away, but you won't tell me why." He sighed and leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed with unease. "Eric, some things don't need an explanation. That lighthouse has a history, stories that go back decades. People say it's cursed, haunted, whatever you want to call it. It's not a place you mess around with." "Come on, Peter," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You can't seriously believe in ghost stories. There's probably some perfectly rational explanation. Maybe someone's been sneaking in there at night, using it as a hideout or something." Peter shook his head. "You don't get it. This isn't just some old wives' tale. I've seen things, Eric. Things I can't explain. And in telling you, stay away from that lighthouse." His words should have been enough to deter me, but they only added fuel to the fire of my curiosity. I didn't press him further, sensing that he wasn't in the mood to talk about it anymore. But the seed of intrigue had already been planted. That evening, after Peter went to bed, I found myself staring out the window again. The lighthouse was just barely visible in the moonlight, a dark silhouette against the star-speckled sky. I waited, my eyes scanning the horizon, half expecting to see the light again. But nothing happened. The next few days passed uneventfully. Peter and I stayed busy with his boat repair business, and I tried to push thoughts of the lighthouse out of my mind. But then, on the fifth night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was out on the porch, enjoying the cool night air, when I heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the ocean, but as I listened closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint, but it was distinct, the crunch of gravel underfoot, coming from the direction of the lighthouse. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was someone out there? "Peter," I called, my voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't respond. He was a heavy sleeper, and his bedroom was on the far side of the house. The footsteps grew louder, and for a moment, I was certain they were heading toward the house. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the sound itself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse racing. Finally, I forced myself to go back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told Peter what I'd heard. He frowned, his expression tense. "You're sure it was footsteps?" "Positive," I said. It wasn't the waves or the winds. It sounded like someone walking on gravel. Peter didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he stood up and grabbed his jacket. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to take a look." "Wait, you're going out there?" I asked, alarmed. He nodded. "If someone's creeping around out there, I need to know." I wanted to protest, but the determined look on his face stopped me. I watched as he headed out the door, his flashlight cutting through the early morning mist. I stayed by the window, my stomach in knots, waiting for him to come back. When he finally returned, his face was pale and his jaw was tight. "There's no one out there," he said, his voice flat. "But you looked, right?" I pressed. "I looked," he said, but there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't telling me everything. After that, things started to feel different. The house, which had once felt warm and inviting, now seemed heavy with an unspoken tension. Peter became quieter, more withdrawn, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. Then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the window. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was soft but insistent, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the room. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. But when I looked, there was nothing, just the empty darkness outside. I got up and walked over to the window, my legs trembling with each step. I pressed my face to the glass, peering out into the night, but there was no one there. Just the same eerie silence that seemed to follow me everywhere lately. The tapping stopped, and I let out a shaky breath. But as I turned to go back to bed, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, far off in the distance. My eyes snapped back to the lighthouse, and there it was again, the faint, flickering light. This time, though, it wasn't coming from the top of the lighthouse. It was coming from one of the lower windows, barely visible through the haze of the night. I stood there, frozen, watching the light as it pulsed faintly. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness once again. The next morning, I told Peter about the tapping and the light. He listened silently, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. When I finished, he shook his head. "Eric, I told you to stay away from that place," he said, his voice low. "I haven't gone near it," I protested. "But something's going on out there, Peter. We can't just ignore it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to tell you. Just stay inside at night, okay? Don't go looking for trouble." His words didn't do much to ease my mind. In fact, they only made me more determined to figure out what was going on. Something wasn't right about that lighthouse, and I was starting to think that Peter knew more than he was letting on. The days that followed were anything but peaceful. The unease I'd been feeling since that first night began to settle deeper into my chest, a constant, gnawing sensation that I couldn't shake. The lighthouse, which had once seemed like nothing more than a weathered landmark, now felt like an ominous presence, looming over everything. I couldn't stop thinking about the flickering light I'd seen in the lower window. It didn't make sense. Peter's insistence that there was no power to the lighthouse didn't align with what he'd witnessed. And then there was the tapping on the window, the kind of sound that burrows into your memory and refuses to let go. Peter had grown quieter, more distant. He spent long hours working on the boat, hardly speaking unless I initiated the conversation. It was like he was trying to pretend nothing was happening, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes darted toward the lighthouse whenever he thought I wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink, I decided I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Peter," I said, breaking the heavy quiet as we sat on the porch. "We need to talk about this. The light, the sounds, I can't just ignore it." He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "There's nothing to talk about, Eric. Some things are better left alone." "Better left alone?" I snapped, my frustration bubbling over. "I don't know what's going on out there, but pretending it's not happening isn't going to solve anything. If you know something, Tell me." He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I've told you everything you need to know. That place is trouble, and you're better off staying away from it." "But why?" I pressed. "What's the history here, Peter? What aren't you telling me?" He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden porch. "I'm going to bed," he said, his tone final. I watched him go, a mixture of anger and worry churning inside me. It was clear that Peter wasn't going to give me any answers. If I wanted to figure out what was happening, I'd have to do it on my own. The first steps toward investigation. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at the lighthouse. I waited until Peter was out running errands, grabbed a flashlight and a pair of sturdy boots, and set off down the narrow path that led to the structure. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to feel. The path was overgrown with weeds, the ground uneven beneath my feet. As I approached the base of the lighthouse, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, its rusty hinges creaking softly in the breeze. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew and salt. The interior was exactly what I'd expected: crumbling walls, broken furniture, and a spiral staircase that wound its way up to the top. But there was something else too. A feeling. It's hard to describe, but it was as if the air itself was charged, humming with an invisible energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I started up the staircase, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the building itself didn't want me there. When I reached the top, I found the lantern room empty, just as it expected. There was no sign of the flickering light I'd seen the night before. But then, as I was about to head back down, I noticed something strange. Carved into the wooden floorboards near the center of the room were symbols, intricate, looping patterns that didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. I knelt down for a closer look, running my fingers over the grooves. The carvings felt old, worn smooth in places, but they were unmistakably deliberate. Who had put them there? And why? I didn't have time to ponder these questions for long. As I stood up, I heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so quiet that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. "Leave." The word was clear, chilling, and it sounded like it had come from right behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but there was no one there. I didn't wait to hear it again. My heart pounding, I hurried down the staircase and out of the lighthouse, not stopping until I was back at Peter's house. That night, I barely slept. The whispering voice, the strange symbols, they replayed in my mind over and over again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a connection I hadn't made yet. Peter noticed my unease the next morning. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his attempt at humor falling flat. I debated whether or not to tell him about my visit to the lighthouse, but decided against it. He had already warned me to stay away, and I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Instead, I turned to the internet, searching for any information I could find about the lighthouse and its history. Most of what I came across was standard fare, construction dates, architectural details, and the like. But then I stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the 1950s. The headline read, "Keeper disappears without a trace." The article detailed the mysterious disappearance of the lighthouse keeper, a man named Arthur Grayson, who had vanished one stormy night. His belongings had been found untouched, and there were no signs of a struggle. The locals had their theories. Some said he had fallen into the sea. Others believed he had simply run away. But there were whispers of something darker, something that wasn't printed in the papers. I read on, my curiosity morphing into something closer to dread. The article mentioned rumors of strange occurrences at the lighthouse, lights turning on and off by themselves, unexplained noises, and a sense of unease that seemed to permeate the very walls of the structure. It was almost too much to take in. Could the stories be true? Was there really something sinister about the lighthouse? The events intensified. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps again. This time, They weren't faint. They were heavy, deliberate, and they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense, and listened. The footsteps didn't move, didn't retreat. They just stopped. "Peter?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. Slowly, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt cold, almost icy. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, before retreating back to my room and locking the door. The next morning, Peter told me he hadn't heard anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't being entirely honest. And then there were the lights. Every night, without fail, the lighthouse would flicker to life. The glow would move from window to window, almost as if someone or something was walking through the building, carrying a lantern. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop on its own. Peter and I had a tense conversation over breakfast that morning. I told him everything, the footsteps, the lights, the voice he'd heard in the lighthouse. He listened in silence, his expression grim. When I finished, he leaned forward, his voice low. "Eric, I told you that place is trouble. But if you're determined to get to the bottom of this, you're not doing it alone." For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. And it was that fear, not the words he'd spoken, that sent a shiver down my spine. The house felt like a hollow refuge, offering little comfort against the reality of what we had just experienced. Peter and I sat in silence for what felt like hours, neither of us daring to speak. The air was heavy with tension, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath us. My ears still rang with the echo of the figure's voice, its layered tone drilling into my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't shake. Peter finally broke the silence. "We're leaving tomorrow. No discussion, no arguments." His voice was firm, but the underlying tremor betrayed his fear. I wanted to agree. I wanted to pack up and leave that instant, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that if we left without understanding what we'd encountered, it wouldn't end there. It would follow us, invading our thoughts and dreams, a lingering shadow in our lives. But I was too exhausted to argue, so I just nodded. "First thing in the morning," I said, my voice barely audible. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's hollow gaze and felt the crushing weight of its presence. The house, once a quiet escape from the world, now felt oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on us. At some point, I must have drifted into a restless slumber because I woke to Peter shaking me. "Eric, wake up," he hissed, his voice urgent. I blinked, disoriented. The room was dark, but I could see the fear etched across his face in the faint glow of his flashlight. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up. "Listen." At first, I heard nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But then, faintly, I caught it, the same layered voices we'd heard at the lighthouse, distant but unmistakable. "They're here," Peter whispered. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever we'd encountered at the lighthouse hadn't stayed there. We didn't wait for morning. Within minutes, we were throwing our belongings into bags, the urgency of the situation overriding any sense of order. The voices grew louder as we worked, filling the air with a cacophony of overlapping tones that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When we stepped outside, the night was eerily calm. The voices faded into the background, as though they were watching, waiting. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its light eerily still now, a stark contrast to the chaos we'd witnessed earlier. The drive back to town was tense. Peter kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I kept expecting something to appear in the darkness behind us, a figure, a flash of light, anything to confirm my worst fears. But the road remained empty, and we eventually reached the small motel on the outskirts of town where we'd stayed on our first night. The familiarity of the place was a small comfort, though neither of us felt safe. Inside the room, Peter collapsed onto the bed, his head in his hands. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was how close we'd come to something we didn't understand, something that felt bigger than us. "We leave," I said finally. "We go home, and we try to put this behind us." Peter looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "Do you think we can?" I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The voices didn't follow us, not audibly at least. But the memories of that night stayed with us, casting a shadow over our lives. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking up drenched in sweat after vivid nightmares of the figures standing at the foot of my bed. Peter became withdrawn, barely speaking and jumping at the slightest sound. We stopped talking about the lighthouse altogether, as though the very mention of it might bring the nightmare back to life. But it was always there, lurking at the edges of our thoughts, a reminder of the unknown we'd faced. Months passed, and life went on, though neither of us were the same. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of what had happened, or at least learn to live with it. Peter threw himself into work, burying his fear under a mountain of distractions. But every so often, when the nights were particularly quiet, I'd catch myself staring out the window, half expecting to see the faint glow of the lighthouse in the distance. And sometimes, in those moments, I thought I could hear the faintest echo of the voices, just at the edge of hearing. A reminder that some questions are better left unanswered. Months turned into years, yet the events at the lighthouse never truly left me. No matter how much time passed, there was a part of me that remained tethered to that haunting stretch of coastline. It wasn't just the figure or the voices that lingered. It was the realization of how fragile the boundary is between the world we know and the one we don't understand. Peter and I eventually drifted apart. It wasn't intentional, but our shared experience became a wedge between us rather than a bond. Whenever we tried to talk about what had happened, it felt like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. So we stopped talking about it. And eventually, we stopped talking altogether. He moved to another state, and our occasional texts became infrequent before stopping completely. I don't blame him. Sometimes, it's easier to forget when you distance yourself from the people who remind you of what you're trying to leave behind. But forgetting wasn't something I could do. The lighthouse, the figure, the voices, it all remained etched into my mind, like a scar that refused to fade. For a while, I tried to research the history of the lighthouse, hoping that learning more might bring some closure. I combed through old newspaper archives, library records, even online forums. What I found only deepened the mystery. There were mentions of disappearances near the lighthouse dating back over a century. Fishermen, hikers, and even a group of students conducting a study on coastal erosion had all vanished without a trace. But the details were sparse, and there was no explanation, just stories and fragments that hinted at something unexplainable. Against my better judgment, I went back to the lighthouse a few years later. I didn't tell anyone, not Peter, not my friends, not even the therapist I was still seeing. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I needed to see it again. I needed to know if it was still there, if the sense of dread I felt was real or something it built up in my mind over time. When I arrived, the area felt unchanged, as though time had stood still. The same rocky cliffs, the same crashing waves, the same lonely path leading to the lighthouse. But there was something different about the air, a heaviness that settled over me the moment I stepped out of the car. The lighthouse stood in the distance, its towering silhouette framed against the overcast sky. It looked weathered, as though it had been abandoned for much longer than a few decades. The light at the top was out, leaving the structure to loom in eerie silence. I stayed far away from it, unwilling to go any closer. Even from a distance, I could feel its presence, as though it was aware of me. I didn't stay long. A part of me wanted to get closer, to peer inside and see if the figure was still there, but I couldn't. The fear was too great, and the memories too vivid. So I turned around and left, feeling both relieved and defeated. Relieved that I hadn't stepped inside, and defeated because I knew I never would. Whatever answers the lighthouse held would remain a mystery, one I wasn't brave enough to confront. Coming back from that final visit didn't bring the closure it hoped for. If anything, It reopened the wound, bringing back the nightmares and the lingering sense of unease. But it also gave me a sense of clarity. Some things aren't meant to be understood. We live in a world where everything has an explanation, a reason, a cause. But what happened at the lighthouse defied all of that. It wasn't something I could rationalize or fit neatly into a box. And maybe that's why it haunted me so much, because it reminded me of how small we are in the grand scheme of things, how much of the world lies beyond our comprehension. It all began in the fall of 2008 in a small town tucked away in the Midwest. I was 25, fresh out of college, and working as a night shift janitor at a hospital that had seen better days. This wasn't just any hospital, it was Willow Point General, a crumbling institution with a history that hung heavy in the air. Everyone in town knew it wasn't the place to go unless you absolutely had to. Rumors of malpractice, strange occurrences, and an unusually high turnover rate for staff swirled like smoke around its name. Still, I needed the job, and frankly, I didn't have many options at the time. It was quiet most nights, with only a skeleton crew of nurses, a security guard named Frank, and me mopping the endless hallways under the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. Frank was in his late 40s, a gruff guy who carried a flashlight even when the hospital was fully lit. Then there was Tina, a nurse in her 30s with a sharp tongue and a laugh that could fill the otherwise empty corridors. She worked the graveyard shift, mostly out of necessity, juggling bills and raising her young son. I wasn't close to anyone there. We were just co-workers passing time until dawn. Still, there was a strange camaraderie that came with sharing the quiet hours. Frank had his rounds, Tina shuffled between patient rooms, and I focused on keeping the place somewhat presentable, even if it already felt like it belonged to another era. The floors creaked underfoot, and the air always seemed heavier inside than out. The hospital wasn't technically abandoned, but it felt close enough. The building itself was massive, sprawling across 4 stories with wings that hadn't been used in years. The East Wing, in particular, had been sealed off since the 90s. No one talked about it much, but it was common knowledge that it had been shut down after a fire that took several lives. The damaged area was never fully repaired. Instead, the administration chose to lock it away and focus on the parts of the hospital that were still functional. Every night, I'd start my shift by mopping the first floor, moving slowly up to the second and third. By the time I reached the 4th floor, it was usually past 2 a.m., and the exhaustion started to set in. That floor was my least favorite. It was where the long-term care patients stayed. Many of them were bedridden, their rooms filled with the faint beep of monitors and the occasional rustle of a nurse checking vitals. Something about it always felt off. I'd often catch myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me even though the hallways were empty. Maybe it was the dim lighting or the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something sour. Or maybe it was the stories Frank liked to tell when we had a few spare minutes to chat. He swore up and down that he'd seen shadows moving in rooms that were supposed to be unoccupied. He even claimed to have heard voices when no one else was around. Tina laughed it off, calling it his overactive imagination. "Frank's been here too long," she'd joke. But when she thought no one was looking, her face would harden, and she'd glance around like she was checking for something unseen. It'd be lying if I said I didn't feel it, too. The hospital wasn't just quiet at night, it was still. The kind of stillness that presses against your chest and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. Sometimes, as I cleaned, I'd hear a door creak open or the faint sound of footsteps. I'd stop, mop in hand, and listen, but there was never anyone there. At first, I chalked it up to the building's age. Old places make noise, right? That's what I told myself, anyway. My routine was simple. Start on the first floor, clean the waiting areas, then hit the stairwell and move up. By the time I reached the top, my mind would be numb from the repetition. That's probably why I didn't notice the odd things at first. A light flickering here or there, a door slightly ajar when I was sure I'd seen it closed. Little things. Things you wouldn't think twice about in a place like that. But as the nights went on, those little things started to add up. It was a Thursday night, just like any other. The kind of night where the hours stretched endlessly and the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than usual. I was on the second floor, wiping down a set of chairs in the waiting area when I first noticed something odd. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. It started with a sound. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the usual creaks and groans of the old building. But this sound was different. It wasn't the pipes or the wind outside. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like soft tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped wiping the chair and froze, my head tilted as I strained to pinpoint the source. The sound was coming from down the hall, somewhere near the stairwell that led to the east wing. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just Frank making his rounds, I muttered under my breath. But I knew Frank didn't walk that quietly, and he never came to this part of the building until after his rounds were done. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to check it out. After all, it was my job to make sure the place stayed secure, and I couldn't just ignore it. As I walked toward the sound, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and my footsteps echoed louder than they should have. When I reached the stairwell door, it was slightly ajar. That was strange. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier in the night. The hospital policy was clear. Doors to the sealed-off wings had to remain locked at all times. I pushed the door open and peered inside. The stairwell was dark, with only a faint strip of light spilling in from the hallway behind me. Everything looked normal at first glance, but there was an undeniable chill in the air. The kind that crawls up your spine and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the sound didn't return. Just as I was about to close the door and walk away, I noticed something on the floor, a faint smudge of dirt leading from the stairs to the bottom of the door. It wasn't much, just a streak of something dark against the otherwise clean tile. I frowned, kneeling down for a closer look. It looked like ash. I grabbed the radio from my belt and called Frank. "Hey, you near the east wing stairwell?" His voice crackled back through the static. "No, I'm down by the Why? There's something weird up here," I said, glancing at the smudge again. "Did anyone go into the east wing tonight?" Frank's tone shifted. "You know no one goes in there. Why? What's going on?" "Probably nothing," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Just some dirt by the door. I'll clean it up." "Be careful," he replied, his voice unusually serious. I hung up and grabbed a rag from my cleaning cart. As I wiped at the smudge, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. It was irrational, I knew that, but the feeling was so strong it made my skin crawl. I finished cleaning, shut the door, and double-checked the lock before moving on to the third floor. For the rest of the night, I tried to push the incident out of my mind, but it stuck with me, nagging at the edges of my thoughts. When I passed Frank later in the hallway, I mentioned it to him again. "You should have just left it alone," he said, his voice low. "Left what alone?" I asked, confused. "The east wing," he replied, his eyes darting toward the sealed-off door at the far end of the hall. "That place. It's better if you don't mess with it." I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "What, you think it's haunted or something?" Frank didn't smile. "You've heard the stories. People don't make that stuff up." Tina joined us a few minutes later, and I told her about the smudge on the floor. She rolled her eyes. "You guys are ridiculous," she said, but there was an edge to her voice that didn't match her words. We didn't talk about it again that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hospital felt different, like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant sound seemed louder, more deliberate. The next night, I was back on the second floor, cleaning the same waiting area, when it happened again. This time, the sound wasn't just faint tapping. It was heavier, more distinct. Footsteps. I froze, my hand tightening around the mop handle as I listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing from the same stairwell as before. Thud, thud, thud. Frank? I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The footsteps stopped, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. When nothing else happened, I forced myself to move, walking slowly toward the stairwell door. It was closed this time, but the same smudge of ash was there on the floor, as if it had been left as a deliberate marker. I bent down, my hands trembling, and reached out to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, like a door slamming shut. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Silence!" I grabbed my radio and called Frank again. "There's someone messing around up here," I said, my voice barely steady. "I'm on my way," he replied. When Frank arrived a few minutes later, we checked the entire floor together. Every room, every corner. But there was no one there. The smudge was gone too, like it had never been there in the first place. Frank looked at me, his face pale. "I told you," he said quietly. "You should have just left it alone." I didn't argue with him this time. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't normal. And it wasn't going to stop. It was Friday night when things took a turn. I was cleaning the staff lounge on the third floor, one of my usual stops during my shift. The lounge wasn't anything special. A few mismatched chairs, a coffee maker that barely worked, and a vending machine that groaned every time someone used it. As I wiped down the counter, the overhead light flickered once, then again, before plunging the room into complete darkness. "Damn it," I muttered, fumbling for my flashlight. The power outages weren't unusual in the hospital, especially in the older sections. I clicked the flashlight on, its narrow beam casting sharp shadows across the walls. The room felt different in the dark, smaller, heavier, like the air itself had thickened. I kept cleaning, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. That's when I heard a faint scraping sound, almost like metal dragging against the floor, coming from the hallway just outside the lounge. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was deliberate, unhurried. Scrape, scrape, scrape. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering. "Frank? Tina?" No response. I stepped into the hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The corridor was empty, its linoleum floor gleaming under the faint emergency lights. But the scraping sound continued, coming from further down the hall near the patient rooms that hadn't been used in years. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn around and walk away, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I moved toward the sound, each step echoing loudly in the silence. As I approached the door to one of the sealed-off rooms, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. My hands were trembling as I reached out to push it open, the old hinges groaning in protest. The room was empty. No furniture, no equipment, just bare walls and a single window covered in grime. But in the center of the floor was a trail of ash, leading from the doorway to the far corner where a small, rusted metal chair stood. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I backed out of the room quickly, shutting the door behind me. My radio crackled to life, and Frank's voice came through. "You good, man? You haven't checked in." I pressed the button, my voice shaky. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just something weird on the third floor. Can you meet me here?" "I'm on my way," he replied. Frank arrived a few minutes later, and I showed him the room. The trail of ash was gone. So was the chair. He didn't say anything, just gave me a look that said, "I told you so." The next night, the activity escalated even further. Tina, Frank and I were in the break room on the second floor, trying to decompress after another tense shift. The small television in the corner was playing some late-night infomercial, its tinny voice filling the space. Tina was mid-sentence, complaining about her car troubles, when the television suddenly cut out. The screen went black, and the room fell silent. "What the hell?" she said, grabbing the remote and clicking buttons. Nothing happened. Before any of us could react, the door to the break room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Tina screamed, jumping out of her chair, while Frank and I froze, our eyes darting toward the door. "Who's there?" Frank shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. Frank and I exchanged a glance before stepping into the hall, leaving Tina behind. The corridor was quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. As we moved further down, we saw it again, a smudge of ash on the floor, leading toward the stairwell to the east wing. Frank stopped, his face pale. "We shouldn't go any further," he said. "We need to figure out what's going on," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. Reluctantly, he followed me as I opened the stairwell door. The air inside was cold, far colder than the rest of the hospital. It smelled faintly of decay, like something rotting just out of sight. We descended the stairs slowly, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. As we reached the bottom, we saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Then, slowly, it turned and disappeared into one of the rooms. Frank grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." I nodded, but something pulled me toward the room the figure had entered. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The room was empty, just like the others, but the air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it was an old, dusty clipboard. The paper on it was yellowed with age, the handwriting faint but legible. It was a patient record. The name had been scratched out, but the date was from over 50 years ago. The words "died during surgery" were scrawled across the bottom in bold, red ink. A sudden noise made me spin around. The door had slammed shut, trapping me inside. I pounded on it, shouting for Frank, but the air seemed to swallow my voice. Just as panic set in, the door creaked open, and Frank pulled me out. "I told you we shouldn't mess with this," he said, his voice shaking. We didn't speak for the rest of the night, but as I walked past the stairwell later, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A faint handprint in the dust on the railing. A handprint that wasn't mine or Frank's. By the end of the week, none of us felt safe in the hospital. The activity was no longer confined to the east wing or the stairwell. It followed us everywhere, lights flickering, doors slamming, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Tina started wearing a cross around her neck, and Frank began carrying a small pocket knife, though neither of them admitted they were scared. And I was right. It had been a week since things took an even darker turn. The building felt more oppressive with each passing day, as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing and shifting. The sounds, the unexplained shadows, the cold spots, all of it was mounting to something far worse than we could ever have imagined. And none of us could shake the feeling that whatever haunted the hospital was getting closer, learning us, studying us. The hospital was quieter tonight than usual. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your thoughts feel suffocated. Tina had left early, unable to handle the tension any longer. Frank and I were the only ones left on the night shift. We were working in the central hallway, organizing old patient records, trying to stay busy, trying to avoid thinking about what was happening around us. Frank was making an effort to joke about it, cracking sardonic comments, but I could see the strain in his eyes. Neither of us had slept properly in days. It was getting harder to focus, harder to ignore the dread that hung over us like a dark cloud. "I can't take this anymore," Frank muttered, rubbing his eyes. "This place is messing with my head." "Tell me about it," I replied, my voice low. The exhaustion was beginning to show in my own face, and I felt a pit in my stomach that only seemed to deepen as the night wore on. That's when it happened. A loud bang from upstairs echoed down the hallway. A sound so sudden and sharp that it felt like the floor beneath us had cracked. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. Frank had already grabbed the flashlight, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps stomping across the floor above us. "Is someone up there?" I called out, my voice tight. No response. The footsteps grew louder, faster, almost like someone or something was running toward us. The floorboards creaked under the pressure, and the sound became deafening. I grabbed Frank's arm. "We need to check it out, now." Frank hesitated. "We're not supposed to be up there. Not after what's been happening." I wasn't thinking about the rules anymore. The fear was overwhelming. There was something, someone, up there, and I needed to know what it was. We had to find out. We took the stairs two at a time, our footsteps echoing in the near silence as we made our way to the third floor. The moment we stepped off the stairs, the air hit us, a cold, damp breeze that felt as if it came from somewhere far deeper than the building itself. Frank shivered and cursed under his breath. "This is insane." We walked down the long hallway, the beam of our flashlight casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to stretch and twitch. The sounds from upstairs had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. I could feel something watching us, something waiting. We reached the end of the hall, where the door to the east wing was still partially open. That damn door, the one that had always been locked, sealed off from the rest of the hospital. But tonight, it wasn't. I exchanged a look with Frank. He didn't need to say it, but I could tell what he was thinking. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't something we were ready for. But we both knew that we had to face it. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, save for the faintest glow coming from a single, flickering light at the far corner. The air was so thick with dust that it almost felt like we were stepping into another time. The floor was covered in debris, papers, broken chairs, and old medical equipment that had long been abandoned. The smell hit us next, a rancid, musty stench that made my stomach turn. And then we saw it. At the far side of the room, standing in front of the shattered window, was the figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its silhouette almost too long, too thin. At first, I thought it was another person, but as I squinted in the dim light, I realized the figure wasn't human at all. Its arms hung too low, its body too gaunt. The face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes, dark, hollow, and unblinking, staring directly at us. I froze. Frank didn't. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, his voice sharp with panic. He took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't," I hissed. "It's not human." The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, feel its presence pressing in on my chest like a heavy weight. My heart raced in my ears, and I could barely breathe. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a low, guttural sound that came from deep within the earth, the figure spoke. "Leave this place, or become a part of it." The words echoed in my head, rattling my thoughts, making the room spin. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to faint. But then Frank broke the trance. "Run!" he shouted, shoving me toward the door. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the room, the sound of our frantic footsteps ringing through the hospital. As we reached the stairs, I glanced back. The figure hadn't moved, but I knew it was watching us. We made it back to the safety of the first floor, breathless and terrified. Frank collapsed onto a bench, his face pale and sweating. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. I had no answer. The first moments after we fled the third floor were chaotic. Frank was nearly hyperventilating, his breath shallow and erratic as he tried to make sense of what we had just seen. I could feel my heart still racing in my chest. Every step I took weighted down with fear, But I knew we couldn't just run and hide. This was bigger than us now. We made our way back to the ground floor, the eerie silence of the hospital pressing in around us. The place had been unnervingly quiet since that figure had appeared. No more strange sounds, no more unexplained events. Just a suffocating stillness that felt even worse than the chaos we had just experienced. Frank leaned against the wall, his hand on his forehead as he tried to steady his breathing. I can't. What was that thing? What the hell is going on here? I didn't have an answer. I didn't think any of us did. The reality was that we had stumbled onto something that we couldn't explain. Something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. There was no turning back now. Whatever had been haunting this hospital wasn't finished with us. I don't know, I muttered, my voice hoarse. But I don't think we're safe here anymore. Frank looked at me, his expression desperate. What do we do? We can't just leave. What if it follows us? What if it's already? I didn't want to say it out loud, but the thought had been hanging in the air ever since we saw that figure. What if it was already inside us? What if it was already part of us? Its cold touch creeping into our minds and souls, leaving us marked in ways we couldn't see. The thought was unbearable, but it wouldn't leave me. I pushed it away, trying to focus on the immediate problem. Getting out of this place. We need to leave, I said firmly, shaking off the fear that had threatened to paralyze me. We can't stay here. We'll find another way to deal with whatever this is. But we can't. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway behind us. Both Frank and I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned slowly, expecting to see that figure again, or something worse. But there was nothing. Just the same oppressive silence that had been hanging over the hospital for what felt like hours. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized we were not alone. Not in the way we had thought, though. Whatever was in this place wasn't bound by the laws of the physical world. It wasn't simply some monster or ghost. It was something more. We need to go, I repeated, my voice more urgent this time. Now. Frank didn't argue. Together, we ran through the hospital, our footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I didn't even know where we were going anymore, just that we needed to leave before whatever was after us caught up with us. We reached the front doors, but they wouldn't budge. They were locked. I tried the handle, pushing and pulling with all my strength, but the door wouldn't open. God damn it, I shouted, panic creeping into my chest. Why won't this door open? Frank rushed over and tried to help, but it was no use. The door was sealed shut. As I looked around, I could see the dim, flickering lights in the distance, the entire building feeling more alive than ever. The weight of it, the oppressive energy in the air, made it feel like the walls were closing in on us. Something was watching us. Something was waiting for us. We're trapped, Frank said, his voice cracking with fear. I swallowed hard, trying to push the panic down. I couldn't afford to lose my head now. If we were going to survive this, we needed a plan. Wait, I said, suddenly struck by an idea. The basement. Frank stared at me. What? Are you crazy? We're not going back down there. We don't have a choice, I said, looking at the locked doors once more. The basement is our only way out. It's got a different exit. If we can get down there, we can find a way out of this place. Reluctantly, Frank nodded. We ran toward the stairs that led to the basement, the eerie atmosphere of the hospital following us every step of the way. The further we went down, the colder it became. The air grew thick and heavy, and the stench of decay became overwhelming. As we reached the basement level, I felt a sharp tug at my chest, a sensation I couldn't explain. Something was wrong. The very air felt different here, as though it was full of whispers and shadows. I could hear the sound of faint scratching coming from somewhere in the darkness. Frank stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. Did you hear that? He whispered. I nodded. We have to keep going. We can't stop now. We moved deeper into the basement, the flashlight's beam struggling to cut through the darkness. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I could almost feel it moving closer, circling us. And then I saw it. A door at the far end of the basement cracked open just a fraction. Light flickered from inside, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. "That's it," I said, nearly breathless with relief. "That's the exit." We rushed toward the door, our hearts pounding in unison. But as we got closer, the temperature dropped drastically. The cold became unbearable, the air thick with an almost tangible force. And then, from the shadows, we heard the voice again. "Leave this place, or become a part of it." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure, the thing from the third floor, was standing in the doorway, blocking our escape. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But then, instinct kicked in. I pushed past Frank, grabbing the door handle and yanking it open with every ounce of strength I had left. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was everywhere now, in the walls, in the very air. We bolted through the door and into the night air, gasping for breath. The building loomed behind us, dark and silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Whatever had been inside that hospital wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching. We never spoke of it again. We left the town the next morning, and neither of us ever returned to the hospital. It's been years since that night, but I still hear the voice sometimes. And when I close my eyes, I can still see the figure, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I don't know what it was or why it wanted us, but I know one thing for sure. Some places, some things, are best left alone. There's a certain kind of dread that stays with you after an experience like that. A sense that something was left unfinished, some thread left dangling in the wind. No matter how far I've gone since then, no matter how many different towns I've moved to, I've always felt that cold sensation on the back of my neck, that unshakable feeling that something is watching me. Maybe it's the stories I've heard since, stories of others who've encountered the same hospital, of people who still claim to hear whispers in the dark and see shadows moving in the corners of their vision. Maybe it's the fact that the building still stands, decaying and forgotten, hidden from the eyes of the world. Maybe, just maybe, there's something still there, something that hasn't let go of that cursed place. I've tried to forget. I've tried to move on with my life, to bury the memory of that night deep within me. But every time I close my eyes, I can see it. That hallway, the third floor, the figure standing in the shadows, watching. I can still feel the cold, that unbearable chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. It's as though that place is still a part of me, still following me, still waiting. When I look back now, I wonder if I could have done something differently. If we could have stopped whatever it was that had taken root in that hospital before it spread any further. But the truth is, we didn't know. We didn't understand what we were up against. All we could do was try to escape, try to outrun it before it swallowed us whole. In the end, it wasn't a matter of fighting back, it was about surviving. But here's the thing. Survival doesn't always feel like victory. When you walk away from something like that, you carry it with you. The weight of it doesn't go away. It lingers. It changes you. You start to question everything you thought you knew about the world. You start to wonder how many other places like that are out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone to come across them. And how many people have already disappeared into them, never to be heard from again. I tried to forget. But the truth is, some things can't be forgotten. Some things stick with you, like a scar that never heals. And no matter how many years pass, that scar will always be there, a reminder of what happened, of what we saw and heard, of what we ran from. It's a strange thing, survival. You think that once you're out, once you're safe, you'll be free of it. But you're not. The memories, the fear, they don't just disappear. They stay with you, lingering in the corners of your mind, creeping up on you when you least expect it. I haven't been back to that town. I haven't gone near that hospital since that night. I don't know if it's still there, still waiting, still drawing in people who are foolish enough to wander too close. But I don't need to know. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some places are better left forgotten. And yet, as much as I wish I could put it all behind me, I can't shake the feeling that you'll never truly be free. That it's still out there, still waiting, still watching. And that someday, somehow, it'll find me again. So, if you're ever near a town with an old, abandoned hospital, a place that everyone avoids, a place that's been forgotten by time, think twice before you go near it. Because you never know what might be lurking in the dark, just waiting for someone to walk through its doors. It was the summer of 2012. I had just turned 25, feeling like the world was mine for the taking. My life had always been pretty routine: work, weekends with friends, the occasional road trip. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was comfortable, and I liked it that way. I had a tight-knit group of people I'd spent most of my time with. Among us, there were no strangers, only old friends who had seen each other through thick and thin. I worked as a carpenter, often finding myself on jobs that required long hours, mostly in quiet, small towns. The work was straightforward, but it gave me the chance to relax in the solitude of nature, which I appreciated. That's what led to the plans for our weekend trip to the nearby forest. A few of us had decided to go camping. It wasn't unusual for us to do so. A few of my closest friends and I had gone camping at least once every year, and each time we'd go somewhere a little more remote than before, looking for that perfect spot to get away from it all. The destination this time was an old forest, a dense, isolated stretch of land that had a reputation for being a little eerie, but was also known for its quiet beauty. The place had always been a source of strange stories, and in a way, that's what drew us to it. We wanted to test our bravery, to prove to ourselves that we weren't afraid of the things people talked about: strange sounds, weird sightings, and odd happenings. None of us were particularly superstitious, but the thought of facing some old urban legends was part of the fun. Our group was made up of 4 people, each with our own little quirks. There was Aaron, a friend who had always been the more skeptical one. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. He liked to consider himself the realist of the group, always with a logical explanation for everything. Then there was Ben, who was easily the most adventurous of us all. Ben had a sort of charm about him, someone who could get anyone to go along with his wild ideas, no matter how crazy they seemed. Then there was myself, someone who, by all accounts, was a little too cautious for his own good, always reading the fine print before making a decision. But that was just me. I like to think things through. And finally, there was Luke, the joker of the bunch. He had a smile that could make even the most uncomfortable situations seem lighter. He was the one who kept the mood upbeat, even when things got serious. We had agreed to camp for 2 nights and explore the forest during the day. There wasn't much of a plan, really, just to walk around, set up camp, and take in the natural beauty of the area. None of us thought anything would go wrong. It wasn't until we arrived that we began to get an unsettling feeling about the place. The forest wasn't like anything we had ever encountered before. The trees were thick, tall, and old, their branches tangled together, blocking out most of the light from the sun. The air felt cooler as we drove in, almost unnaturally so, and the road was narrow, barely wide enough for our old SUV. The few houses on the outskirts of the forest looked abandoned, with no signs of life or activity. It wasn't the most inviting place, but we shrugged it off. After all, we were there for an adventure, and there was no turning back now. We parked at the edge of the forest and began walking in, setting up camp near a small clearing we found. The atmosphere was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Even the usual sounds of birds and animals seemed muted. We joked about it, saying the forest was just that quiet, but deep down, something about it felt wrong. It was the kind of place that made you feel as if you were being watched. At night, the shadows stretched far longer than they should, and the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing up the space between us and the trees. Still, we tried to ignore the discomfort, laughing and telling stories by the fire. But no matter how hard we tried to keep the mood light, there was a nagging sense that we weren't alone. I remember vividly looking up at the sky that first night. It was so clear, almost too clear, like the stars were too bright, almost unnatural. As the night went on, the unease grew. Ben made a few jokes about how the forest was haunted or cursed, but the laugh was hollow, and we all felt it. I didn't want to admit it, but as the wind rustled through the trees, I began to feel that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the darkness or the strange silence. It was the way the forest seemed to stretch on, endlessly. We all went to bed early, hoping the morning would bring a change in atmosphere. But it didn't. The forest had a way of settling into your bones, making you feel like you were trespassing on something ancient, something that didn't want to be disturbed. But we were there for fun, nothing more. We hadn't yet seen anything that would make us think we were in danger. But it wasn't long before things started to change. I'll never forget that first night, or the second morning, when I woke up with a feeling that something was different. That's when the strange events started. But that's a story for another time. The morning after we set up camp, things didn't feel any better. The strange weight that hung in the air the previous night had only intensified. We tried to ignore it, but the forest didn't allow for distractions. It was a constant, nagging presence, like something breathing just behind your ear. But we were there for fun, right? We weren't going to let the unsettling atmosphere get to us. We decided to venture further into the forest that morning. The sun had risen, but the thick canopy of trees overhead kept much of the daylight from reaching the ground. The further we walked, the more isolated we felt, like the world beyond the forest didn't exist anymore. There was no sign of wildlife, no birds singing or squirrels darting around. It was as if the forest itself had a hold on everything, controlling what could and couldn't be heard. At one point, Luke, trying to lighten the mood, threw a branch into a nearby stream, sending a ripple across the water. As the ripples spread, something unusual happened. There was a low, almost inaudible thump that seemed to come from beneath the water, like something heavy had shifted. None of us said anything at first, but it felt wrong. The water stilled, the noise stopped, and for a split second, there was a feeling of absolute silence, as if the whole forest had gone still with us. I glanced around. There was something about that moment that didn't sit right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Ben, ever the optimist, shrugged it off with a laugh. Probably just a rock or something. You know, with how deep this stream is, he said, but his voice had a slight edge to it. He wasn't fooling anyone. We pressed on, but it was clear that something had shifted. Aaron, who had been quiet most of the walk, suddenly spoke up. Does anyone else feel like we're being watched? We all stopped in our tracks. He wasn't looking at any of us, but instead, his eyes were darting around, scanning the trees like a man who knew something was hiding just out of view. You're just being paranoid, Ben said, trying to brush it off with a half-hearted laugh, but even he didn't sound convincing. Aaron was usually the least affected by anything strange, but the way he looked at the trees made us all uncomfortable. We continued walking, but with each step, the feeling of being watched grew. It was subtle, a quiet pressure on the back of your neck. Every now and then, I could swear I heard something, just a rustle of leaves, the sound of a branch snapping. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was when we reached a particularly dense part of the forest that the first real sign of something being off occurred. The trail we had been following seemed to suddenly vanish. It was as if the forest had swallowed it up. No more footprints, no more cleared path, just thick underbrush and towering trees. Where's the trail? Luke asked, his voice now carrying a note of unease. We all stopped, scanning the area. Nothing looked familiar. The trees were too dense, the brush too thick. We must be taking a wrong turn, Ben suggested, but there was hesitation in his voice now. We had all been following the same trail, yet somehow it had disappeared. And as we stood there, trying to figure out what happened, a cold gust of wind swept through, sending a shiver down my spine. It was the first real chill I had felt since arriving. "We need to head back," Aaron said, his voice urgent. There was no longer any hint of doubt in his tone. He had gone from being the skeptic to sounding almost frightened. But we didn't argue. The uncertainty of where we were made everyone uneasy. As we turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A faint trail of footprints, smaller than ours, appeared in the dirt. They didn't look like animal tracks, too round, too distinct. It was like they had been made by shoes, yet none of us had seen anyone pass through this area. "Those weren't here a minute ago," I said, pointing them out. Luke and Ben both looked at the tracks, but Aaron's face went pale. He didn't say anything, but I could see his eyes darting around, scanning the trees. It was the kind of look you get when you feel the presence of something you can't explain, but know is real. "Let's just go," Aaron said sharply. His usual calmness was gone. He was suddenly in a hurry to leave, and it was clear that whatever had been set in motion with those footprints had unsettled him. It unsettled all of us. We started back in the direction we thought we had come from, but as we walked, the feeling that something was wrong only deepened. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, feeling the weight of eyes on me, but every time I turned, there was nothing. It was as if the forest itself had become more oppressive, pushing in around us, trapping us in its embrace. When we finally broke through the trees and saw our camp in the distance, the relief I felt was overwhelming. The open space, the familiar tents, and the crackling campfire were a welcome sight. But as we approached, I noticed something else. There was a faint, unnatural stillness in the air. The winds had stopped, and the forest was silent once again. It was as if the world had paused for a moment. We made our way back to the campfire and sat down. The strange events of the morning had left us all quiet. Ben tried to break the silence, but his usual confidence was gone. "It's probably nothing," he said, but it didn't sound convincing. None of us said much after that. We were all trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no one had an explanation. The strange footprints, the disappearing trail, the eerie silence, it was all too much to dismiss as coincidence. And that was only the beginning. It didn't take long before the second unsettling event occurred. But that's another part of the story. As the day wore on, the sense of unease that had settled over us grew stronger. The forest no longer felt like a place for adventure. It felt like a maze, like it was watching us, anticipating our every move. We tried to distract ourselves by going about the usual camping routine, gathering firewood, joking about the weird occurrences of the day, trying to shrug it off, but the atmosphere was too thick, the silence too heavy. That night, things took a turn. We were gathered around the campfire, but even the flames didn't seem to warm the chill that had crept into the air. The fire crackled and popped, but the surrounding trees stood still, eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant sounds of night animals, just a void of silence. The dark shapes of the trees loomed, stretching longer and more menacing in the flickering firelight. It was then that I noticed something strange in the distance. A light. A faint, unnatural glow coming from deeper in the forest. It flickered like a candle, barely visible through the trees. I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I stared harder, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a reflection or a firelight. It was its own light, glowing from somewhere far off, as if calling to us. "What do you think that is?" Ben asked, his voice low. He must have seen it too. We all sat there in silence, eyes locked on the eerie light that seemed to dance among the shadows. Aaron was the first to move. He stood up, his gaze still fixed on the glow. "We need to check it out," he said, his voice not quite steady, but filled with a determination that none of us could ignore. He was usually the level-headed one, but something about his expression made me hesitate. He didn't seem like he was just curious. He seemed compelled. "I don't know, man," Luke replied, his voice trembling. "That doesn't look right." But Aaron had already started toward the trees, and the rest of us followed, though reluctantly. We moved in silence, each of us trying to shake the creeping sense of dread that had followed us all day. As we drew closer, the air grew colder. My breath misted in front of me, even though it wasn't that cold. The smell of damp earth and pine needles seemed to grow stronger, but there was something else too, a strange, pungent odor that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual forest smell. It was sour, almost metallic, and it made my stomach churn. We reached the area where we had seen the light, but there was nothing there, just trees, underbrush, and that suffocating silence. No glowing, no strange light, nothing to explain what we had seen just moments ago. We stood there for a moment, scanning the trees and the shadows, but it was as if the forest had swallowed it all. "What the hell?" I muttered, feeling the first real surge of fear. This wasn't some optical illusion or a trick of the light. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it had just toyed with us. Aaron, undeterred, pushed forward, moving deeper into the forest. "We're close." "I can feel it," he said, his voice almost a whisper, like he was trying to convince himself more than us. The rest of us followed, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the unspoken fear of being the only one who didn't know what was going on. The trees around us seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like fingers, and the air felt thicker, heavier. It was as if the forest was pressing in on us, not just from the outside, but from within, too. The deeper we went, the less the world outside seemed to matter. There was only the trees, the shadows, the unsettling stillness. Then, suddenly, Ben stopped. His face went pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. He pointed ahead of us. "Look," he gasped. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I followed his gaze and felt my heart drop into my stomach. There, in the distance, was something moving, a shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it wasn't quite human. The figure stood motionless, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams, its form shifting between the trees. At times, it seemed to blend into the shadows. At other moments, it was too distinct to ignore. We all froze. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, thumping loud in my ears. No one said anything, but we all knew what we were seeing wasn't natural. It wasn't just a man in the woods, nor an animal. It was something else. Something that belonged to the dark. Aaron, driven by something I couldn't understand, started walking toward the figure. "It's just a person," he muttered, though his voice was shaky. "It's just someone lost, that's all." But the rest of us stayed where we were. There was no reason to move closer. There was no good reason to investigate further. "Let's go back," I whispered. "We shouldn't be here." But Aaron didn't hear me. Or if he did, he didn't care. He stepped forward, and just as he did, the figure moved. Not in a way that felt natural, but in an unnatural, jerky motion, like it was being controlled by something unseen. It shifted from tree to tree, slowly, deliberately, and I realized with a cold jolt of fear that it was coming closer to us. Ben grabbed Aaron's arm, pulling him back. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking. The figure moved again, this time faster. It was no longer hiding behind trees, but moving directly toward us. The forest seemed to tilt around us, the trees bending, the shadows twisting. And then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, something that shouldn't have come from a living being. It was a mixture of whispers and growls, each word scraping across my mind like nails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have come here." I don't know who screamed first, but we all ran. We didn't look back, we didn't speak. We just ran as fast as we could, through the dark, through the suffocating silence, the twisting trees, the low growls that seemed to follow us just at the edge of hearing. When we finally stumbled back into the clearing where our camp was, I felt like I was waking from a nightmare. But even then, the feeling that we weren't alone didn't go away. We couldn't shake it, not even with the warmth of the fire, not even with the comfort of the tents. Something had followed us, and we knew we weren't safe. The air around us had turned suffocating, the silence even more profound. We huddled near the campfire, trying to gather ourselves after the horrors of the forest. The flames flickered violently, casting long shadows that danced like specters around our campsite. But no matter how close we stayed to the fire, no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves that the creature, or whatever it was, had gone back into the woods, a sense of dread lingered. It hung over us like a heavy cloud, pressing in with every breath we took. Ben was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "We need to get out of here. Tonight." He wasn't wrong. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. We were miles from the nearest road. Our phones had no signal, and the only way out was through that same cursed forest. The same forest that had just tried to swallow us whole. The fire crackled louder, as though feeding off the tension in the air. For a few moments, no one said anything. We just stared into the flames, all of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to figure out what had just happened, what was happening to us. Then, the ground beneath us trembled. I thought it was just my imagination at first, a trick of the mind, but then I saw it, Ben's face, pale and wide-eyed, staring at the earth beneath his boots. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The trembling grew stronger, more pronounced. The fire flickered violently, almost as if it was struggling to stay alight. The entire campsite felt wrong, like it was alive, like it was breathing, pulsing with something dark and ancient. And that was when I heard it, an unmistakable sound. A low, guttural growl emanating from the trees just beyond the firelight. I froze. We all did. The growl wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't an animal or even a human. It was something else entirely, deep, resonant, echoing through my bones. The hairs on my neck stood on end. The blood in my veins seemed to freeze, and my entire body went stiff with fear. The sound was followed by a series of sharp, crackling noises, the sound of something moving quickly, breaking branches, approaching us. I could feel it. It was closing in. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. "We need to leave now," Ben shouted, his voice rising in panic. But even as we moved to grab our things, the growling grew louder. And then, through the trees, I saw it, a figure, towering and dark, stepped into the clearing. It was massive, almost impossible to comprehend. It wasn't human, not by any means. Its limbs were long and twisted, moving in unnatural, jerky motions. It had no face, or at least none that I could see, but the outline of its body was unmistakable. It was wearing the shadows like a cloak, each movement sending ripples through the air. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat closed up, and the words died before they could escape. "Move," Aaron shouted, his voice breaking as he grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the tent. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature standing before us. The figure stepped forward, its long arms reaching out, dragging the darkness with it. The air around us grew colder, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, as if the very earth was alive. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and panicked. The creature made no sound now, but I could feel it in my bones, its presence pressing down on me. In that moment, everything slowed. My thoughts, my heart, the world around me, everything seemed to stretch, like time was pulling itself in. And then, the creature spoke. Its voice was not like a human's, not even like an animal's. It was like 1,000 voices, overlapping, distorting reality itself. It spoke words that were not words, sentences that didn't belong to this world. "You are trespassers." The words echoed in my mind, vibrating through my skull like a thunderclap. I could feel my knees give out beneath me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if the creature's gaze, if it had one, was pulling me in, drawing me into some deeper, darker place. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it lunged. There was no warning, no sound, just a blur of motion and a rush of air as the creature moved toward us. The force of it sent me crashing to the ground, and I felt something sharp graze my side, tearing through the fabric of my jacket. A scream caught in my throat, but it was swallowed by the sound of the earth cracking beneath the creature's weight. The campfire sputtered and died, leaving us in total darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and tried to find the others. But the darkness was absolute, smothering, and I could hear nothing but my own ragged breath. My mind raced with panic. We had no weapons, no way to fight whatever this was. And even if we could, how could we possibly hope to survive something like this? I finally found Ben, crouched low and trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "What? What do we do?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. The creature was still out there, moving between the trees, its growls now mixed with guttural roars, and I could hear it closing in. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get as far away as possible. But where would we go? How could we escape something that was everywhere, that seemed to know every step we took, every breath we drew? And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard something even worse. A voice. Not from the creature, but from the trees, from the very ground beneath us. A voice that wasn't human, that wasn't even close to being human. It called our names, one by one, its tone mocking, twisted, like it was savoring our fear. It knew us. It had been watching us from the very beginning, from the moment we set foot in this cursed forest. The sounds of it moving through the woods were overwhelming. My hands shook as I gripped Ben's arm, trying to steady myself. The forest was closing in on us, the trees towering like silent sentinels, watching our every move. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the creature's roars. But even as the words left my lips, I wasn't sure where out even meant. We were lost. There was no path to follow, no clear direction to take. Every way we turned, the forest seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. Ben nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. "We can't stay here." The ground beneath us seemed to shudder again, more violently this time. The earth seemed to groan with some ancient power, like it was alive, like it was part of the creature itself. I could feel the pulse of it in my feet, in my bones, and I knew that there was no escaping the forest. Not unless we figured out what it wanted from us. "We need to get to the road. It's the only chance we have," I said, my mind scrambling for a solution. But with every passing moment, the dark figure in the trees drew closer, its shape only partially visible in the distance. Its outline was like a twisted silhouette, a nightmare made real, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed with an unnatural light. Ben's hand trembled as he gripped mine, his breath shallow and quick. We began to move, stumbling through the underbrush, desperately trying to find our way. But it felt like the forest was playing tricks on us. Every step we took seemed to lead us deeper into the trees, farther from the path we needed to be on. "Are we getting any closer?" Ben asked, his voice breaking. "I don't know," I said, my throat tight. My thoughts were racing, but there was no clear answer. We couldn't see anything, couldn't tell if we were even headed in the right direction. We pressed on, every step heavy with dread, when suddenly there was a sharp crack, like the sound of a branch snapping. I turned quickly, heart hammering in my chest. The creature had stopped growling. There was an eerie silence in the air, and I couldn't tell if it was closer or farther away. But the absence of sound felt even worse than the growls. Then, without warning, we heard a voice. "Turn back!" It wasn't the creature. It wasn't any of us. The voice was familiar, soft, and almost pleading. It came from behind us, from the depths of the trees, but there was no mistaking it. It was the voice of someone we knew. It was my sister. I froze, my blood running cold. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to Ben. "Did you hear that?" Ben nodded, his eyes wide with panic. It can't be, but it sounded so real. So much like her voice that I couldn't ignore it. We stood there, caught in a web of fear and confusion, as the voice called out again. "Please, turn back." I shook my head. No, this couldn't be happening. The forest was playing tricks on us. It had to be. But as I stood there, paralyzed by doubt and fear, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just barely visible in the darkness of the trees. I blinked and it was gone, but I was sure it was her, sure that it was my sister standing there in the shadows. I didn't know what to do. Should we follow the voice? Should we run? Ben grabbed my arm. We can't listen to it. We can't trust anything in here. He was right. I knew that. But the doubts still gnawed at me, pulling me in two directions. The need to find a way out warred with the nagging feeling that we couldn't leave without answers. And then, as if in answer to our hesitation, the creature let out a horrible roar, the ground shaking beneath us. It was time to run. There was no more time for doubts. We bolted, pushing through the trees, not looking back. The sound of the creature's movement came from all sides now, the woods alive with its twisted presence. I could feel it closing in, just steps behind us. My legs burned with exertion, but there was no time to slow down, no time to stop and think. I had to get out of here, and I had to get Ben out with me. In the distance, I could see it, a break in the trees, the faint outline of a road. My heart skipped a beat. We were almost there, almost free. But just as we were about to reach the clearing, something grabbed my ankle, pulling me to the ground. I screamed as I hit the earth hard, the air knocked from my lungs. My vision blurred as I looked down to see a twisted, gnarled hand wrapped around my leg, its fingers impossibly long, its skin cold and slimy. It was the creature, dragging me back into the forest. I fought with everything I had, kicking and pulling, but the grip was unyielding. I could hear Ben shouting, but his voice was distant, drowned out by the sound of my own panic. My chest tightened as I struggled, fear flooding every inch of my body. I could feel it pulling me deeper into the shadows, into the dark heart of the forest. And then, just as I thought I would be lost forever, I felt it, Ben's hand, pulling me free. With one final yank, he tore me away from the creature's grasp. We were free, gasping for breath, covered in dirt and blood, but we were alive. We stumbled out into the clearing, the road just a few feet away. Ben and I didn't say a word as we made our way toward the road, our eyes constantly scanning the woods behind us. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We made it to the road. We didn't stop running until we reached the nearest town, nearly 20 miles away. By then, the sun was rising, and the forest was just a dark silhouette on the horizon. But even now, I don't know if we truly escaped. The memory of that night lingers in my mind, a constant weight that I can't shake. We never spoke of it again. We didn't need to. The woods had changed us. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear it calling us back. The days after we escaped the forest were a blur, as though time itself had bent and shifted. The small town we reached that night became our refuge, a place where we could try to heal from the horrors we had experienced. But no matter how far we ran, no matter how much distance we put between us and that forest, the memory stayed with us. It haunted us like a shadow that refused to fade. Ben and I never spoke much about what happened. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us, something unsaid that neither of us could quite put into words. What happened in those woods had changed us in ways neither of us could fully grasp. It wasn't just the terror of the creature or the fear that gripped us in the dark. It was something deeper. A part of us had been lost in that forest, a part that we couldn't reclaim no matter how hard we tried. I spent months in that town, trying to move forward. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the darkness of the woods. I could hear the rustling of the leaves, the growls echoing in my mind. It was as if the forest had imprinted itself on my soul, and there was no escape. One night, long after we'd left, I found myself back at the edge of those woods. I don't know why I went. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, some instinct to face the thing that had nearly destroyed us. Whatever it was, I found myself standing at the threshold of that dark, silent place once again. The forest was still as haunting as ever, its shadows stretched like fingers reaching out to pull me back into the depths. But now, there was something different. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy, and the trees seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. I stood there, staring at the place where our nightmare had begun, and I wondered, had we truly escaped? Or had we merely run away, leaving a part of ourselves behind? A voice, familiar, like the one we'd heard that night, sounded in the distance. But this time, it was clearer, more real. "You can't escape me." I turned, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the trees, the same as before. But as I looked deeper into the forest, I saw it. The shape, the twisted figure, just beyond the tree line. It was waiting for me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them clearly. I knew in that moment that the forest hadn't just been a place. It was a force. A force that had been watching us long before we stepped foot in it. And it would continue to watch. Perhaps it was something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I turned away and left the edge of the forest behind, my footsteps quickening as I walked back to the town. But the feeling didn't leave me. The weight of it, the knowledge that something out there had marked me, stayed with me. As if the forest had claimed a part of me that I couldn't reclaim, no matter how far I went. It's been years now since that night, and I've moved far away from that town, from those woods. But even now, I still feel its pull. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear the faintest whisper calling me back to the forest. I don't know what it wants or why it's so insistent, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That the forest is still out there, waiting. And if it calls again, I don't know if you'll be able to resist. It was the fall of 2010 when I found myself in a situation I never thought I'd experience. I was on a solo road trip, driving through small towns, trying to shake off the feeling that life had somehow become mundane. I didn't have much of a destination in mind, just an open road and a restless soul. After a few hours of driving, I reached a small, sleepy town nestled away from the hustle and bustle. The kind of place where nothing much happens, and that's exactly what I wanted at the time. I pulled into a gas station, grabbed a coffee, and asked the clerk about any decent places to stay for the night. She pointed me down the road to a hotel that seemed to fit the bill. Quiet, old-fashioned, and cheap. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was tired from the long drive, and the weather had started to turn chilly. The hotel was an old Victorian-style building with a dark, imposing facade. The windows were framed with ivy, and the sign outside flickered weakly in the dusk light. There was something odd about it, but it was late, and I wasn't in the mood for looking around any further. I'd stayed in places like this before, nothing fancy, just a bed and a roof over my head. It would be fine. Or so I thought. I walked into the lobby, and the dim light cast long shadows across the floor. An elderly man stood behind the desk, his hair white as snow, his face weathered by time. He greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but I brushed it off. After all, small towns tend to have their quirks. He handed me a key, one of those old brass ones, and gestured toward the stairs. "Room 217, he said in a voice that was surprisingly soft for someone who looked so frail. I thanked him and made my way up to my room. I didn't notice anything strange at first, just a typical rundown hotel room with a single bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto an empty street. The air smelled of dust and old wood. I set my bag down, turned on the TV for some background noise, and sat down to relax. The silence of the hotel was eerie, but I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a hotel, right? Nothing to worry about. As I lay in bed, ready to call it a night, I thought about how life had a funny way of taking us places we never planned on going. There's something about the road, how it makes you question things, how it opens up parts of your mind you didn't even know were there. It was supposed to be a peaceful stop, but I could feel something gnawing at the back of my mind. A sense of unease I couldn't quite shake. But I was tired, and the thought of a good night's sleep outweighed whatever nagging feeling had started to creep up on me. I closed my eyes and drifted off, thinking tomorrow would be just another day on the road. That was before I had the first dream. It wasn't really a dream, more like a vision. I could see the hotel, but not as it was in the present. It was alive, full of people walking the halls, laughing, talking, and moving about. But something was wrong. The people's faces were blurry, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. I could hear whispers, but they didn't make sense. The only thing I could focus on was the staircase at the end of the hallway. It was narrow and winding, stretching upward like a dark tunnel. I felt drawn to it, compelled to climb it. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The room was still. There was no sound except for the faint hum of the old air conditioner. But the unease lingered. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the hotel. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but as I lay there in the dark, I realized that something about this place wasn't quite right. The morning came slowly, as if the hotel itself was hesitant to start the day. I awoke with the same unease still lingering in my chest, though I tried to dismiss it. It was just a weird dream, right? Just a result of the strange atmosphere of the hotel. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a product of my overactive imagination, especially after a long drive and little sleep. So I forced myself to push through it. I grabbed my things, ready to get some breakfast at a diner across the street, and decided to take a quick walk through the hotel's lobby to stretch my legs before hitting the road again. As I passed through the narrow hallway outside my room, I noticed something strange. It was the faintest sound, almost like a door opening and closing, coming from somewhere further down the hall. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the low, flickering lights overhead. I paused for a moment, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. I thought it was probably just the old building settling or the wind moving through the cracks in the walls, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. I had seen no one walking around, and yet the sound was persistent, as if someone was moving around the hallway. I glanced at the doors to the rooms along the corridor. They were all closed. Still, the sound continued, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The strange thing was, the sound wasn't consistent. It came in quick bursts, like a door creaking open, then a pause, followed by the sound of footsteps, then more silence. It didn't make any sense. I couldn't figure out if it was a strange noise from the building, or if there was someone else in the hotel. I stood there for a while, waiting for the noise to stop, but it never did. Just as I was about to walk back to my room, the door at the end of the hall creaked open, and I caught a glimpse of someone. No, something, standing there. I couldn't make out their face clearly, but I could see their silhouette. The figure stood motionless for a moment and then slowly moved out of view, down the hallway toward the stairs. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where they had been. My heart started racing as I felt the uneasy sense that something wasn't right in this hotel. The figure wasn't moving like a person. Their movement was slow, deliberate, almost unnatural. I quickly made my way back to my room, locking the door behind me, trying to calm my nerves. It didn't make sense. Maybe I was just overthinking it. It was probably some other guest going to the bathroom or a cleaning staff member taking a break. But something in me felt differently. The silence that followed felt too oppressive, too heavy, and I couldn't escape it. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing, but the feeling of being watched kept creeping into my mind. I didn't want to stay here longer than I had to, but I had no other place to go. It was early, and I didn't want to head back out on the road just yet, so I decided to stay a little longer. I pulled out my laptop and tried to focus on something to distract myself from the eerie feeling that filled the room. But the hotel itself seemed to be closing in on me. As I sat there, lost in the glow of the laptop screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just outside the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild, but then I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps outside my door. They were slow, methodical, and they stopped right outside my room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. My eyes snapped to the door, and I listened. The footsteps weren't going away. They were just standing there, as if waiting for something. I wasn't sure if I should open the door or not, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, cautiously approached the door, and pressed my ear against it. I heard nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I waited a moment before slowly opening the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But the hallway was empty, completely silent. There was nothing. No sign of anyone. I stood there for a while, my mind racing. Could it have been the wind again? Could it have been someone playing a prank or just my nerves getting the best of me? I wasn't sure, but I didn't want to take any chances. I closed the door quickly and bolted it shut. My instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of this place before anything worse happened, but there was a part of me that wanted to stay, to understand what was going on. Was I just imagining all of this, or was there something more sinister happening behind the walls of this hotel? The unease was building, gnawing at me like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. But I decided to push on for a bit longer. After all, I was just passing through, and I was probably just imagining things. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than my overactive imagination. Maybe it was the building settling or the wind making noises. But there was something in the air that day. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like the hotel was watching me, waiting for something. It wasn't just the odd noises, but the strange feeling of being followed, as if something was lurking just beyond my sight. I packed up my things and headed out of the room, making my way down the stairs and into the lobby. As I passed the front desk, I gave the elderly man a nod and a forced smile, trying to act like everything was normal. He didn't say a word as I walked out the door, and when I stepped outside into the cool morning air, I breathed a sigh of relief. But as I turned to look back at the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The image of the empty hallway, the sounds of footsteps, and the strange figure lingering at the end of the hall all kept playing in my mind. I thought maybe it was time to put some distance between myself and this strange place. It's strange, isn't it? How easily you can begin to dismiss the things you can't explain. At first, I told myself it was just an odd series of coincidences. But as the hours dragged on, it was harder to ignore the creeping dread that hung in the air. Each time I returned to the hotel, I felt it, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me, like a thick fog that seeped into every corner of the building. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the hotel was hiding something in its creaking walls. It was later that afternoon, after it had taken a long walk to clear my mind, when the first truly unsettling event happened. I had returned to my room, hoping to rest and get some work done. The sky outside had grown dark, and the wind began howling through the cracks of the building, sending a chill down my spine. The hotel's old pipes rattled and groaned, and the lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. I sat down at the small desk near the window, my thoughts scattered, trying to focus on anything that could take my mind off the unease that was gnawing at me. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. I kept hearing the faint sound of footsteps, like someone was pacing the hall outside. At first, I chalked it up to the building's age. Old houses make noises, after all. But when the sound continued, it felt less like a random noise and more like someone deliberately walking back and forth. I got up and walked to the door. The hallway outside was empty. I stepped out, my shoes making the faintest echo against the worn wooden floorboards. I felt a cold breeze that seemed to swirl in the hallway, though there were no windows open. The faint sound of shuffling footsteps returned, growing louder as I walked deeper down the corridor. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. There was no one else in sight. My pulse quickened as I passed by room after room. Each door seemed to hold a secret behind it, each one darker than the last. I was just about to turn back when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from one of the rooms. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was unmistakable. It was like someone was talking to themselves, low, indistinct, but enough to make my skin crawl. I stepped closer to the door from where the sound had come, but before I could touch the doorknob, the whisper stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. My heart hammered in my chest, and I was suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. The footsteps had stopped. The winds outside had died down. Everything was still, unnervingly still. I turned back toward my room and retreated inside, locking the door behind me. I sat down on the bed, hands trembling, my mind racing. Had I really heard someone? Or had my mind just been playing tricks on me? Maybe it was the stress of the long drive, the uncertainty of being in a strange place. But no matter how I tried to reason it away, something deep inside me knew there was more to it. The hotel wasn't normal. There was something wrong with it, something I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the evening trying to keep myself occupied. I watched TV, read a book, anything to distract me. But when the darkness of night settled in again, it felt even heavier than before. The strange noises had returned. This time, I couldn't ignore them. The footsteps had escalated, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of doors creaking open and shut, one after another, in rapid succession. The rhythm was off, too fast, too methodical. It was like the hotel itself was breathing, shifting, moving in ways it shouldn't. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight from the drawer and left my room, determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences. The hallways were bathed in the dim light from the flickering bulbs overhead, casting long shadows across the walls. As I walked, the sounds grew louder, closer, like someone or something was following me. I came to the door of the room where I had heard the whisper earlier. My hand hovered over the doorknob. I wasn't sure if I was brave enough to open it, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was dark, much darker than I'd expected, despite the low light spilling in from the hallway. My flashlight flickered for a second as I panned it across the room. It looked normal, at least on the surface. The bed was unmade, as if someone had left in a hurry. But there was something odd about the air, stale, heavy, as if it had been closed off for years. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I moved further into the room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The bed wasn't just unmade. It was as though it had been torn apart, the sheets in disarray, scattered across the floor. And then I saw it, a faint outline on the wall. Something had been scratched into the paint. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I stepped closer, I saw it more clearly. Words smeared into the wall like someone had carved them in a hurry. The words were jagged, almost indecipherable, but the message was clear. Leave before it's too late. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was no one else in the room. The footsteps, the whispers, the strange markings on the wall, it was all starting to make sense. This wasn't just an old hotel. There was something much darker going on, something I had barely scratched the surface of. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The door to the hallway was wide open, and I was standing in the middle of the room, all alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed toward the door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, coming from somewhere deep within the hotel, echoing through the empty halls. It wasn't just one set of footsteps anymore. It was multiple, moving closer, getting faster, like a parade of people marching in time. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them, could feel their presence closing in on me. The air was suffocating, thick with the sound of their approach. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where to go, but I knew one thing. I had to get away from whatever was here. The hotel was alive, and I was just another pawn in whatever twisted game it played. I ran through the hallway, my breath ragged, the sounds of footsteps and whispers filling the air around me. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me further into the maze of hallways. The building seemed to stretch, growing longer with each step. The exit door was nowhere in sight. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not after everything it seemed. I had to find the truth, even if it meant facing whatever horrors the hotel was hiding. By now, the very air inside the hotel felt oppressive, as if it was pressing down on me from every direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was closing in. The footsteps had stopped, but the weight of their presence lingered in every corner, every crack in the walls. The strange whispers had gone quiet too, but I could still hear the faintest echoes in the back of my mind, like a melody that had been haunting me for days. I had retreated to my room, locking the door behind me and clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Every time the wind howled through the cracks, it sounded like a distant voice, calling me, beckoning me to come closer. But I couldn't. I knew better now. Whatever was happening in this hotel, whatever was causing these strange events, it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. I had to get out. But something told me that the way out wasn't just through the door. I was pacing back and forth, trying to think of a plan, when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But this time, they weren't just coming from the hallway. The sound was right outside my door, slow and deliberate. My heart raced in my chest as I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped completely. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door handle jiggled. I stepped back in a flash, adrenaline surging through me. My hand gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The handle rattled again, and I could hear the faint sound of something, scraping against the door. A chill ran down my spine as the scraping turned into a low, guttural growl, like an animal trying to break in. I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of the mind, a product of stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't imagining this. Something was trying to get in. I had no choice. I needed to find out what was behind that door, but not through the usual means. I wasn't just going to open it. I grabbed my bag and hurried toward the window, hoping to find another way out. The sky outside was dark, the wind whipping through the trees below. I could barely make out the shadows of what appeared to be an abandoned courtyard. Maybe there was a way to escape through there. But as I reached for the window, something stopped me. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. A deep, resonating creak echoed from the hallway. The door groaned under pressure, as if whatever was out there was forcing its way in. But then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The wind outside howled again, and the silence in the room grew deafening. It was then that I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. The blood drained from my face. The laughter wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from behind the door. I turned toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. The low growl had turned into a soft, high-pitched giggle, as though a child was playing on the other side. But there was something off about it, something twisted. The laughter wasn't joyful. It wasn't playful. It was chilling, distorted, like it was coming from something that shouldn't exist. I took a step back, heart pounding, mind reeling. What was going on in this place? What was behind that door? And more importantly, what was it trying to tell me? I didn't have time to think. The room seemed to tilt, the air becoming thick with a presence that I couldn't name. The temperature continued to drop, and my breath formed visible clouds in front of me. Then, in a flash of cold, someone was standing in front of me. I staggered back, nearly falling to the floor, as a figure appeared out of thin air. It was a child, small and gaunt, with pale, hollow eyes that stared right through me. Its clothes were ragged, torn in places, and its skin was an unnatural shade of gray, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The child, if it was even a child, didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with its empty gaze, its small lips curling into a sickening smile. The room felt colder still, and I could see my breath in front of me now, swirling like smoke. The child tilted its head, as if studying me, before it opened its mouth wide, too wide, unnaturally wide, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The sound that came from its mouth was inhuman, a screeching, scraping noise that made my bones rattle. I turned, heart hammering, and ran for the door. But as my hand reached for the handle, I heard a voice, soft and insistent, right behind me. Leave. Now, or it's too late. I spun around, but the child was gone. The room was empty. The temperature had returned to normal, and the wind had stopped howling. But the sense of dread still lingered, heavy in the air. I was shaking, sweat clinging to my skin. What had just happened? Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? But as I stood there, still trying to make sense of what I had just seen, a movement caught my eye. On the floor, where the child had been standing, there was a small, faint imprint, a mark on the ground, as though something had been dragged across the floor. It was a symbol scratched into the wood with something sharp, something powerful. I couldn't make it out, but it was unmistakable. It was a warning. Leave! But it was too late for that. I could feel it now, that presence, closing in on me, suffocating the air around me. I wasn't alone in the hotel. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. And now I had no way out. The growl returned, this time louder, more insistent. I turned, but this time I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The hallway was full of figures, dark, shadowy shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light. They were walking toward me, their footsteps slow and deliberate, their forms flickering like smoke. I had no choice but to run. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how many corners I turned, they were always there, closer and closer, their presence swallowing everything in its path. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I reached the front door of the hotel. But the door didn't open. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed shut, as if the building itself was refusing to let me leave. Panic surged through me as I struggled with the door handle, pulling and yanking as if sheer force could make the impossible happen. My breath came in shallow gasps, heart pounding in my chest, but no matter how hard I tried, the door refused to budge. The shadows in the hallway were closing in, their shapes flickering like distorted figures, and the air was thick with an unrelenting sense of dread. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. With a final, desperate attempt, I stepped back from the door, taking a moment to assess my surroundings. The flickering lights above cast an eerie glow over the lobby, and I could still hear the faint scratching noise coming from behind the door, the growls, the whispers, the footsteps. It was all becoming overwhelming, a a cacophony of terror that I couldn't escape. But then, as if on cue, a voice broke through the chaos. A voice I hadn't heard in what felt like days, one that sounded strangely familiar. "You have to leave. Now." I whipped around, heart racing, expecting to see the gaunt child from earlier. But there was no one there. The voice had come from within me. It wasn't just a voice. It was a realization, a truth that I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just hearing things. The hotel, the place itself, was alive. It had been pulling me in, drawing me deeper into its twisted web with every passing moment. It had been waiting for me, and it wasn't going to let me leave. But I had no choice. The door wouldn't open. The hotel itself was closing in on me. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I turned, walking away from the door, ignoring the increasing pressure behind me, the suffocating sense of being watched. My eyes fell on the nearby stairs, leading up to the second floor. The hallways up there were no different from the ones below, dimly lit, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. But there was something about them now that felt different. I felt a pull, a force, guiding me towards something I didn't understand. There was no turning back. I couldn't leave through the front door, and I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever it was that haunted this place to claim me. The only option left was to find the source of the power that had taken hold of the hotel. And so, with nothing left to lose, I made my way up the stairs. The silence up there was deafening, the air thick with tension. I could feel it, something waiting in the shadows, just out of sight. The temperature dropped once more, and I knew that whatever had been hunting me was still very much alive, just biding its time. I reached the second floor hallway, my steps echoing through the stillness. There was a sense of finality in the air now, like the hotel was drawing its last breath before the inevitable. My hand gripped the railing tightly as I moved forward toward the room at the end of the hall, the one I had been drawn to since the moment I arrived. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I hesitated at first, my mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. But I knew I had no choice. I had to face whatever was inside. I pushed the door open, and the air inside was thick with an oppressive presence. The room was dark, save for the faintest light coming from a single flickering candle on the far side of the room. But it wasn't the candle that caught my attention. It was the walls, covered in strange symbols, etched into the wood with something sharp, something ancient. And in the center of the room, a figure stood. It was the child. But it wasn't just the child. The child had been a manifestation, a tool used by the hotel to draw me in. The true source of the hotel's power was standing before me now, its form shifting and changing, a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and rise. Its eyes glowed red, burning with a malevolent energy that seemed to reach out and grab me. This was it. This was the thing that had been controlling everything, the whispers, the shadows, the strange happenings. It wasn't just the hotel that was haunted. The hotel was the creature, a living, breathing entity that fed on fear and desperation. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. My heart sank. There was no escape now. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to act. I had to fight back. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a broken piece of wood from the floor, and held it out in front of me like a weapon. The creature in front of me let out a guttural hiss, its form shifting and expanding, as though it were getting ready to pounce. I could feel the energy in the room crackling, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. In a desperate move, I lunged forward, driving the wood into the creature's form. But instead of meeting resistance, it passed right through it, as though the creature wasn't really there. The air around me shimmered, distorting everything in sight. I froze, realizing that the creature wasn't something I could fight. It wasn't something physical. It was a manifestation of the hotel's power, a force that couldn't be defeated by simple means. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The room was silent again. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive presence that had filled the air seemed to lift. I stood there for a moment, stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had it been real? The marks on the walls, the creature, it was all too much to process. But one thing was clear. I had to get out. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. The hotel had tried to claim me, but I had managed to escape, at least for now. I turned, looking for the door, but before I could reach it, the voice came again, this time, louder, more insistent. Leave now, before it's too late. And with that, the door opened on its own. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran down the hallway, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the front door. The shadows in the hotel still lingered, but I didn't care. I was free. The door opened as if nothing had ever happened. I stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting my skin like a breath of life. I didn't look back as I walked away, the hotel standing tall and silent behind me. I didn't know what had truly happened that night. I didn't know what had caused the hotel to come alive or what the creature was. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never return. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and disbelief. I didn't know what to tell people. How could I explain to anyone what had happened? What I had experienced? It wasn't just a nightmare or some trick of the mind. No, it was something much darker. Something that had taken hold of me, mind and body, and refused to let go. I had tried to move on, to shake off the images of the hotel, the flickering lights, the eerie whispers that still echoed in my mind at night. But the truth was, I couldn't forget. I couldn't forget the feeling of being trapped, the suffocating pressure of the hotel closing in around me, the sensation of being watched by something that was never truly seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the child's face, those hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at me. I could still hear the creaking of the old wooden floors, the doors slamming shut behind me as the creature emerged from the shadows. No matter how hard I tried, the memories wouldn't leave. For weeks, I avoided sleep. I didn't want to close my eyes, didn't want to risk reliving those horrifying moments. The nightmares became a constant, creeping presence in my life. Even in the middle of the day, I would catch myself jumping at every small noise, every flicker of light. I couldn't trust anything anymore. The world felt different, as if everything around me was just a mask for something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. I tried to convince myself that the hotel was behind me, that I had escaped its grasp. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There were pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit, things that didn't make sense. The child, the symbols on the walls, the creature that seemed to disappear into the air, none of it had a logical explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was still out there, still waiting for the next person to wander into its traps. I never told anyone about what happened. Not really. The few people I tried to confide in just gave me strange looks, telling me that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But how could I explain something so real? How could I make them understand the terror that had gripped me in that hotel? There was one night, a few weeks later, when I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, staring out the window into the darkened streets below. I hadn't gone back to the hotel, of course. I couldn't, but something gnawed at me. I kept thinking about the child, about the way the hotel had felt alive, about how it felt its presence pressing against me, a force that refused to let me go. I couldn't help it. My curiosity got the best of me. I went online and searched for anything related to the hotel, its history, its past, any rumors or stories people had shared. I found nothing. It was as if the hotel had never existed. No records, no reports of strange occurrences. It was as though the place was a ghost, wiped from the face of the earth. But then, buried deep within an obscure forum thread, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a single comment, written years ago by someone who claimed to have stayed at the hotel long before I had. It was simple, cryptic, and to the point. It's not the hotel. It's the place between the worlds. It calls you in, then takes you when you're ready. I didn't understand what it meant at first, but the more I thought about it, the more the words sank into my mind, taking root. I realized that maybe, just maybe, The hotel wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a haunted structure. It was something more, something ancient, something that existed outside of the normal laws of time and space. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never truly left the hotel. Not entirely. It had followed me. It had attached itself to me, its presence lingering like a shadow. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I tried to forget, it would always be there. Watching. Waiting. I don't know if I'm being paranoid, or if something truly did latch onto me that night. But there's something inside me now. A seed of fear that continues to grow, twisting and warping every thought, every sensation. Sometimes I feel it again. The flicker of the lights, the pressure building in the room, the feeling of eyes on me. I still hear that voice, the one that whispered to me in the dark. Leave now, before it's too late. But I can't leave. It's already too late for that. As I sit here, writing these words, I know that the hotel still exists. I know that it's out there, somewhere, and that it's waiting for someone else to step inside, someone else to feel the cold grip of its power, someone else to get lost in its endless halls. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. It was supposed to be just a fun day of hiking. We'd been hiking together since we were kids, navigating the familiar trails around our hometown. Our group was made up of 4 people. Me, my best friend since high school, another close friend who joined us recently, and his younger brother, who was a bit of a troublemaker, but always seemed to make everything interesting. Together, we made the perfect group for a little adventure. The sun was still high in the sky when we parked at the edge of the woods, the tall, overgrown trees casting long shadows over the narrow dirt path that led into the wilderness. We had all packed light, just some snacks, water bottles, and the basics for a couple of hours in nature. Nothing about the day seemed out of place. We were in our usual spirits, joking, laughing, and chatting as we began our trek. The leaves crunched under our boots, and the occasional breeze made the branches above rustle softly. As we walked, I took the lead, glancing down at the map, trying to make sense of the markings. It looked like there was an old, abandoned cabin somewhere deeper in the woods, maybe a mile or 2 from where we stood. We weren't sure if it was just an old hunting lodge or something more, but I was intrigued by the idea of finding a place no one seemed to talk about. It felt like we were about to stumble onto some kind of hidden treasure. The further we went, the less familiar the woods became. The trail began to narrow, and the trees grew denser, blocking out more of the sunlight. We'd ventured into these woods many times before, but something about this particular path felt different. It was quieter, too. The usual sounds of birds, wind, and distant animal calls seemed distant, almost absent. But no one mentioned it at the time. We just carried on, chatting about everything and nothing, just like we always did on our hikes. After about 45 minutes of walking, we finally reached what looked like the clearing on the map, but there was no cabin in sight. Just a dense cluster of trees and a deepening darkness that felt unnatural. My friend, who had been following closely behind, raised his voice to suggest we turn back, but I didn't want to. I was determined to find what the map led to, and something inside me urged me to go further. So we pushed on, ignoring the growing unease that seemed to creep into the air around us. We trekked through the thickening underbrush, the ground softening with wetness as if we were walking through a damp sponge. The smell of decaying leaves filled the air, and there was a heaviness in the atmosphere that none of us could quite explain. Every so often it'd stop and look around, but I didn't want to admit that something felt off. I told myself it was just the woods, the way they could sometimes feel imposing, especially as the sun dipped lower. It was then that we found it, the cabin. It was almost hidden among the trees, the roof covered in moss, and the walls dark and weather-beaten. A sense of unease washed over me as I studied the structure. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something unsettling about it. Something that made me hesitate. I stood there for a moment, listening. There was an odd stillness in the air, and even the trees seemed to stand completely silent. I looked back at my friends, who were now standing behind me, their faces reflecting the same unease I was feeling. "Should we go in?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Yeah, why not?" one of my friends answered, though his tone was more cautious than before. What's the worst that could happen? The idea seemed ridiculous now, thinking back on it. What was the worst that could happen? We were in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles. But at the time, I was eager, almost desperate to see what lay inside. I took a step toward the cabin, and that's when I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but it was now open just enough to show a glimpse of darkness inside. "Is that normal?" the younger brother asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and fear. I shrugged, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the woods. The air felt colder as we stepped inside, and the darkness seemed to swallow us. We pulled out our flashlights, the beams cutting through the thick shadows. Inside, the cabin was in a state of disrepair, but it was clear that it hadn't been completely abandoned. There were old chairs piled in a corner, a dusty table in the center, and a small stone fireplace. The walls were lined with faded pictures, mostly portraits of people I couldn't recognize. But what struck me most was the smell, an overpowering, musty odor mixed with something I couldn't quite place. As I stepped deeper inside, my foot hit something soft. I turned my flashlight toward the floor and froze. A small, weathered doll lay there, half buried under a pile of leaves and dirt. It was strange, unsettling. It didn't seem like something you'd leave in a place like this. It felt wrong, like it had been intentionally placed there, waiting for someone to find it. I picked it up, feeling the cold, stiff texture of the doll in my hands. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless head. And yet, something about it felt alive. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's go," one of my friends whispered from behind me. His voice trembled slightly, and I could hear the unease in it. "This place gives me the creeps." I nodded and dropped the doll, quickly turning toward the door. But as I did, the cabin seemed to shift, as if the very air inside had thickened, pressing down on us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the change was undeniable. I could feel it. We didn't waste any time getting out of there. But as we hurried back down the path, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered with every step, a gnawing sense that something wasn't quite right. We never spoke of it as we made our way back through the woods, but none of us felt quite the same. It was like the forest had closed in around us, watching, waiting. We never spoke about that doll again, but it wasn't the last time we felt the weight of those woods. Something in them had changed that day, something we would never understand. We left the woods in haste, but the unease we felt didn't dissipate once we reached the edge of the trees. The walk back to the car felt longer than it had before, the silence oppressive as each of us tried to shake off the feeling that something was following us, something unseen, yet undeniably present. But we didn't talk about it, not yet. It was just a strange moment, we told ourselves. Maybe it was the isolation, the darkness, the unknowns. We'd go home, forget about the cabin, and carry on with our lives. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. When we got back to the car, the woods behind us seemed to close off, their towering trees like silent sentinels watching us retreat. We climbed into the vehicle, the doors slamming shut with a finality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling of being sealed off, like we had left something behind, something we shouldn't have. But we didn't speak of it. The drive home was mostly quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the quiet hum of the road the only noise. But I couldn't shake the feeling of the doll. I kept picturing it in my mind, its smooth, featureless head, the weight of it in my hands. When we reached my place, I felt an odd sense of relief. The familiar surroundings, the warmth of my house, should have washed away any lingering dread. I should have been able to relax, to move on from the woods. But something in the pit of my stomach refused to settle. I couldn't let go of the feeling that we hadn't truly left the cabin behind. That, somehow, it was still with us. I pushed the thought away as we all filed inside, and we quickly fell into the familiar rhythm of unwinding from the hike. My friend, who had been uneasy during the hike, kept glancing over his shoulder, almost as if he expected something to appear. The others sat down, chatting quietly, but I noticed the tension between us. No one was quite comfortable. We all knew something was wrong, but none of us had the courage to bring it up. It wasn't until we settled in and I made some tea that things started to take a turn. The first incident happened late that night. It was past midnight, and I had just finished tidying up the living room. I was about to head to bed when I heard it, a soft thud coming from the hallway. I paused, listening. Nothing. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that only comes after the hustle of the day has ended. I thought maybe it was just the house settling, but it came again. A gentle thump, like something lightly falling. I turned around, half expecting to see one of my friends standing in the doorway, but the hallway was empty. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to face the others. They all paused, and then one of them, the youngest of us, shook his head. "What? I didn't hear anything." But I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't really believe it. He was just trying to brush it off, trying to stay calm. The others exchanged looks, and I could see the unease creeping into their expressions. "Maybe it's just the wind," one of them suggested, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. "I don't know. These old houses make weird noises." I nodded, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But something in the back of my mind whispered that it was more than that. We all decided to ignore it and go to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was quiet again, but it was a strange, almost suffocating quiet, as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting. As I lay in bed, the unease grew. I kept hearing faint noises, soft scraping sounds, like something brushing against the walls outside my room. It wasn't the wind. There was something deliberate about the noise, but I forced myself to ignore it. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I managed to drift off into a fitful sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as it could be. We went through the motions of the day, eating breakfast together and laughing about the hike. But there was a thin layer of tension between us, something unspoken hanging in the air. It wasn't until later that afternoon that we noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. We were sitting in the living room, watching TV, when we saw it. It was subtle at first, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The door to the room where we had left our gear, my hiking boots, jackets, and bags, slowly creaked open by itself. We all froze. None of us had moved. The room was still, and yet the door opened, inch by inch, as if something invisible was gently pushing it. "Did you see that?" one of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't need to answer. We all saw it. It wasn't a gust of wind, and it wasn't a draft. The door hadn't been left ajar, it was closed, and yet now it opened on its own. A heavy silence fell over the room as we all stared at the door. "Is someone playing a prank?" one of them said nervously, looking at the rest of us. But the doubt in his voice betrayed the uncertainty in his eyes. "No way," I replied, shaking my head. "No one's touched that door." The door creaked to a stop halfway open, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, one of us stood up, walking slowly toward the door. He reached for the handle and pushed it the rest of the way open. We all followed, expecting to see something out of place. But nothing had changed. Our gear was still where we'd left it. Nothing had been disturbed. The room seemed as ordinary as ever, but the unease had returned, more intense than before. "Maybe we're just imagining things," I suggested, though even I didn't believe it. I could see the doubt in the other's eyes, the same suspicion that was growing in me. We went about our day, trying to act like it was nothing. But when night fell again, the odd occurrences became more frequent. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, faint but distinct, as though someone was walking just out of sight. I would go to check, but every time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Then, that night, something more unsettling happened. I woke up to a cold draft brushing against my skin, though the windows were closed. My eyes snapped open, and I immediately felt the weight of the darkness in the room. The air was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay there, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a soft scrape against the floor, coming from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest. Slowly, I turned to the side, staring into the blackness of the hallway beyond my room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I wasn't the only one who heard it. When I looked over at my friends, I saw that they too were wide-eyed, their faces pale. We all silently agreed that we needed to get to the bottom of it. But none of us were eager to step outside into the hall. Instead, we lay there in the dark, hoping that whatever was happening would just go away. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to stop. Something was in the house with us, something that had followed us back from the woods. The unease had settled in like a weight on our chests, thickening the air with every passing hour. The subtle disturbances had become more frequent, each incident more intense than the last. I could feel the tension growing in the house, a silent pressure pressing against us, urging us to do something, anything to break free from the feeling of being trapped. Wed tried to brush it off, tried to laugh it away. But the events kept escalating, each one impossible to explain, each one leaving a lingering sense of dread. It started in the kitchen. One afternoon, we were preparing lunch, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. I was chopping vegetables, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board, a familiar, comforting noise. But then, just as I reached for the salt, I felt it, a sudden, sharp chill creeping across my skin. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when a window's been left open or when the air conditioning kicks on. It was a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to come from nowhere. I froze, my hand hovering above the salt shaker. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, a faint mist rising in front of my face. The others didn't notice at first, too caught up in their own tasks, but I could feel it. "Hey, did anyone else feel that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. One of my friends, the quietest among us, turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" The chill had disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only the lingering sense of something watching. But the unease didn't go away. Instead, it grew. Later that night, the sounds grew louder. It was no longer just the faint creaks of the house settling or the occasional scrape. Now, there were distinct, deliberate sounds, footsteps pacing back and forth outside the door, a low scratching noise like nails dragging across the walls. Each noise seemed to come from a different part of the house, but no matter where we went, the sound followed, just out of reach. "Someone's messing with us," one of them muttered, his voice laced with fear. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe it, not anymore. We tried to act normal, tried to laugh it off, but the tension was palpable. We all knew something wasn't right. And that's when we decided to investigate. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the house with us. It wasn't just a presence, It was something else, something older, something that had been here long before we ever stepped foot inside. The air felt thick with it, heavy with the weight of something. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed out into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. I moved slowly, the beam of the flashlight flickering as I swept it across the walls. The house had never seemed so dark. The corners of the rooms were swallowed by shadows, and every step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it feel like I wasn't alone. I stopped outside the room where we had left our gear, the door still slightly ajar from the night before. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should go in, but the scratching noises were louder now, coming from within. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped inside. At first, everything seemed normal. Our bags were still where we had left them. But then, I saw it. The doll. It was lying in the middle of the floor, its blank face staring up at me. I didn't remember leaving it there, and I couldn't understand how it had gotten out of the bag. I crouched down to pick it up, and as my fingers brushed against the cold ceramic, a jolt of electricity shot through me. It was as if the doll was alive, its presence sending a wave of discomfort over me. I quickly stood up, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there, to leave the room and never come back. But just as I turned to leave, I heard the distinct sound of something moving behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. I didn't wait around to find out. I rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. I wasn't sure what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing, it was getting worse. And we were running out of time. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to tell the others what had happened. They were already on edge, and I didn't want to add to their fear. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the feeling of being watched hit me again, like a physical weight pressing down on me. The air was thick with tension, and I could see that the others were struggling too. We all gathered in the living room, sitting together on the couch, trying to act like everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. We all knew it. The whispers were getting louder, the shadows seemed to shift when we weren't looking, and there was always the sense of something just behind us, watching, waiting. One of them, one of the more skeptical ones, finally spoke up. "Okay, enough. We need to figure out what's going on. This isn't normal." The rest of us agreed. We couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. We had to find out what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever was in the house with us. We decided to search the house, to check every room and every corner. As we went through the house, I noticed things that hadn't been there before. Small things, insignificant things, but enough to make me feel uneasy. A book out of place on the shelf, a picture frame turned sideways, the faint smell of something burning that I couldn't place. Every room seemed wrong, as though it had been touched by something that didn't belong. We even ventured down into the basement, where the air grew colder the further we descended. The darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides, the flashlight beam struggling to push back the shadows. And that's when we found it. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old boxes, was an old, rusted door, one we hadn't noticed before. It was strange, out of place, as though it had been hidden from view on purpose. We stood there, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one spoke. But we all knew this was it. This was the thing that had been watching us, the thing that had been behind the strange occurrences, the thing we had all been too afraid to acknowledge. And that was when the real horror began. The door was old, ancient even, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime. But what stood out most was the lock, a rusted padlock hanging from the door's handle, as if someone or something had deliberately kept it sealed. It was as though this door had been hidden away, tucked into the corner of the basement for years, maybe decades. I felt a chill run down my spine as my fingers hovered over the lock, trembling. None of us had seen this door before. None of us had ever noticed it, not in all the years we'd spent in the house. But now it was impossible to ignore. The others were standing behind me, their eyes wide, a mixture of fear and curiosity pulling at their faces. We all knew, deep down, that this was the source. This was where everything had started. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the lock. For a moment, I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. Should we really open it? What if this was a mistake? What if we were unleashing something that shouldn't be disturbed? But then, the silence broke. The quiet, oppressive stillness of the house was shattered by a sudden, sharp noise, like nails scraping against a chalkboard. It came from the other side of the door, a screeching sound that sent my heart into overdrive. The others gasped, stepping back instinctively, but I couldn't move. I had to know. With shaking hands, I twisted the lock and pulled the door open. A wave of stale, musty air hit me in the face, a suffocating cloud that made it hard to breathe. The dim light from our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, revealing only the outlines of old, forgotten furniture and debris. But as I stepped inside, my flashlight beam landed on something else, something far more disturbing. In the farthest corner of the room, sitting against the wall, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a pile of old clothing or a mannequin, but then I saw it move. A slow, deliberate movement, like something shifting in the darkness. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of pure terror through me. "Did you see that?" One of my friends whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't need to answer. We had all seen it. The figure wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe with words. It was a mass of shadows, a formless shape that seemed to flicker and change with every passing second. And the more I stared, the more I felt it watching me, studying me, as if it had been waiting for us to find it. Then, the figure stood up. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The others screamed, their voices filled with panic and disbelief. But I couldn't look away. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnatural, jerky, as if it was struggling to move at all. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were impossibly long, stretched out in ways that didn't seem possible. The darkness around it seemed to ripple, as if the very air was being sucked into its presence. The shadows moved with it, swirling around the figure like a cloak. And then it spoke. At first, the voice was a low hum, like the sound of wind passing through trees. But then it grew louder, more distinct, a voice that was both familiar and alien at the same time. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, its voice rasping with a strange, otherworldly quality. I froze, unable to respond. The others were shaking, backing away, their eyes wide with terror. But I couldn't tear myself away from the figure. I had to know. We didn't know," I stammered, my voice shaky. "We didn't mean to disturb you." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. "You should not have come." With that, the air around us grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. I could feel my breath fogging in front of me, the chill biting into my skin. But it wasn't just the temperature that had changed, it was the very atmosphere. The room felt alive, thick with something ancient and malevolent, something that had been here long before we had ever arrived. The figure moved again, its limbs contorting unnaturally, the shadows following its every movement. As it stepped closer, I could hear the scraping of its fingers against the floor, the sound like fingernails on glass. "Leave," it hissed, its voice now a guttural growl. "Leave now, before it's too late." But before any of us could react, something else happened. The floor beneath our feet groaned, and suddenly, the entire room seemed to shift. The walls began to close in on us, the space narrowing, as if the house itself was alive and angry. The shadows grew thicker, the darkness swallowing up everything around us. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I could feel the pressure of something pressing against my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. The others were in the same state, their faces pale with terror, their bodies trembling. And then the figure stepped forward, reaching out with a long, bony hand. It was too much. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I reached out, trying to push it away, but my hand passed right through it, like it wasn't even there. The figure's laughter echoed in my mind, a low, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. "It's too late now," it whispered. "You should have never come here." Suddenly, everything went black. I don't know how much time passed. All I remember is the suffocating darkness, the feeling of weightlessness, and the sharp, guttural whispers in my ear. When I finally opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the basement, gasping for air. The others were around me, their faces just as shaken as mine. But something was different. The room felt impossibly heavy, the air thick with the oppressive weight of fear. I could barely catch my breath, my chest tightening as if something unseen was holding me down. The others were still on the floor with me, but none of us spoke. We just sat there in silence, trying to process the chaos that had unfolded in front of us. The figure, the thing that had tormented us, still lingered in the corner, its hollow eyes watching us, unwavering. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it were waiting for something, waiting for us to make a move. But what could we possibly do? "What do we do now?" one of the others whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking too loud might provoke the entity further. The fear was palpable in the room, and I could feel it creeping into my bones. It was a sensation unlike anything I had ever experienced, like I was being smothered by an invisible force, a presence that existed only to make us feel small, insignificant, helpless. The shadows seemed to grow larger with every passing second, crawling toward us, swallowing the edges of the room, tightening the space until there was no room left to breathe. "We have to leave," I said finally, my voice shaky. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a desperate need to escape, to get away from whatever this was, before it consumed us entirely. But as soon as the words left my mouth, a strange sound filled the air, a soft, unholy whisper, like the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. My heart pounded in my chest as the temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into my skin, my bones. "I can't move," someone murmured. I feel like it's holding me here." I glanced over at the others, and sure enough, they were all frozen, their bodies stiff and unresponsive, as though some invisible force had pinned them in place. But then it hit me. That feeling, the sensation of being trapped, of being unable to escape, was not just physical. It was something deeper, something psychological. It was as if the figure, the entity that had haunted us, was pulling at the threads of our very thoughts, bending our wills to its command. I could see it now, clearer than ever. The figure was no longer just a shape in the dark. It was more than a shadow, more than a thing. It was a presence, something ancient, something powerful. And we were nothing but intruders, trespassers in its domain. The room shifted again, the walls warping and bending, stretching as though the house itself were alive. I could feel the ground beneath me rumble, as if something huge, something monstrous, was moving under the floorboards. The sounds of creaking and cracking filled the air, a cacophony of torment and warning. The house, this house, had never been just a house. It had always been a prison, a cage for something much darker. And we had come too close. "It's trying to trap us," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to get out of here." I grabbed hold of one of my friends, shaking him desperately, trying to rouse him from his paralysis. But it was no use. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead at nothing. He was stuck, trapped in whatever nightmare this place had become. And then the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It shifted, its form bending and contorting, twisting through the air like smoke. In the blink of an eye, it was in front of me, looming over me, its face just inches away from mine. I could feel the coldness emanating from it, a suffocating chill that seemed to penetrate every layer of my skin. "You should not have come here," it whispered, its voice barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in my mind. "Now you are mine." I recoiled, my heart racing. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a declaration. And it was too late to turn back. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to my feet. My legs felt weak, unsteady, but I couldn't stop now. The others were still frozen, paralyzed by fear, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. I had to find a way to break free. I turned to the others. "We have to leave now," I said, my voice firm, even though my insides were screaming in terror. "We have to fight it. Whatever it is, whatever it wants, we can't let it win." But even as I spoke those words, I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me. The air was so thick, so heavy, that it was hard to think clearly. Every step felt like I was wading through thick mud, the walls seeming to close in tighter and tighter with each passing second. I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. "We need to break the hold it has on us," I said, my voice hoarse. "We can't let it control us. We have to fight back." I grabbed hold of one of my friends, pulling him to his feet. For a moment, he didn't move, his body stiff as though it were made of stone. But then, slowly, his eyes blinked. He gasped for air, as if breaking free from some invisible grip. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You were frozen," I said, barely able to explain. "But we're not out of this yet. We need to get out. Now." The others slowly began to stir as well, shaking off the paralysis that had held them captive. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat, pulling back just a little, as if the figure was losing its grip. But I knew it wasn't over. The entity was still here, still watching, still waiting for its chance to claim us. With one final glance at the figure, whose form seemed to shimmer and shift, becoming more and more distorted, I turned and bolted toward the stairs. My legs felt like jelly beneath me, but I kept moving, forcing myself up the stairs and toward the front door. The others followed, stumbling and gasping for air, but we were too far gone. The house was alive with the sounds of shifting walls, groaning beams, and that low, ominous whisper that still echoed through the halls. The door was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of something dark and dangerous pressing down on us, pulling at our heels. Finally, we reached the door. I grabbed the handle, yanking it open with all the strength I had left. The night air hit us like a shock, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside the house. We ran. We ran until our lungs burned, until we couldn't feel our legs anymore. But we didn't stop. We didn't look back. And as we reached the edge of the woods, the sounds of the house faded, swallowed by the distance. The whispers, the shadows, the figure, it was all gone. But I knew, deep down, that we hadn't escaped. We had only bought ourselves time. Because whatever that thing was, whatever had been lurking in the dark corners of that house, it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. The days following that night felt surreal, as though we had stepped into some new reality where the line between what was real and what wasn't had become blurred. The fear that had gripped us inside the house never quite left, lingering like a shadow that hovered just beyond our reach. We had escaped, yes, but a part of us remained tethered to that place, the cold, oppressive house, and whatever it was that had dwelled within it. We tried to return to normalcy. We tried to bury the terror deep within us and go on with our lives, but there was always an unsettling quiet that followed us wherever we went. It wasn't just the silence of the world around us. It was something deeper, something that pressed against our skin like an invisible weight, a constant reminder that we had encountered something unnatural. I found it hardest to sleep. Every night, as I lay in bed, the darkness would settle around me, and for just a moment, I would feel it again, the cold that had filled the house, the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped me. In that final moment, I would hear the soft, echoing whisper, as if the figure had followed me home. The room would feel too small, the walls too close. My body would freeze in place, my breath catching in my chest, as if the thing was standing right there beside me, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was just fear, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something about that house had changed me. It had changed all of us. And as much as I wanted to move on, to forget about that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness we had encountered hadn't really been left behind. Weeks passed, and life continued, but the grip it had on me never loosened. I tried to distance myself from the others, trying to block out their voices, their shared experiences. But we all knew. We all felt it, even if we never said it out loud. We were connected by that night, bound by the horrors we had witnessed, the terror that still lingered in the depths of our minds. There were moments when I would hear a noise, a creak in the floorboards, or a whisper too soft to catch. My heart would race in an instant, my pulse quickening as I looked around, expecting to see something, someone, in the corner of my vision. But there was never anything. Nothing except the silence. I don't know what the figure was or what it wanted, but I know it was not a creature of this world. It wasn't something that could be explained away with reason or science. It was ancient, something that existed in a space beyond time, beyond our understanding. And the house, it was its domain, its prison. We had trespassed, and in doing so, we had unlocked something we shouldn't have. I think about that night often, more than I care to admit. I wonder if we had made a mistake by running. What if we had stayed, faced it head on? Would it have consumed us, or would we have found a way to fight back? I don't know. But what I do know is that we'll never truly escape the aftermath. The fear, the uncertainty, the haunting sense of not being alone. And as time goes on, I wonder, what would have happened if we had never left? Would we have been trapped forever, bound to the house as it fed on our fear? Or had we somehow weakened it by escaping, even if only temporarily? I try to tell myself it's over. I try to reassure myself that the nightmare is in the past. But there's always that nagging thought at the back of my mind that someday, somehow, it will come back. The house, the shadows, the figure. It's not gone. It's just waiting, watching. And though I don't know when it will return, I know one thing for certain. There's no such thing as truly escaping the darkness.